which did not prevent him from employing all manner of devices to improve the position. His charmer came regularly late to meals. He did the same, with intent to waylay her. He dallied over his toilet, was not ready when Joachim knocked, and let his cousin go on before he would catch up with him. He would wait until the intuition proper to his state warned him of the right moment. Then he would hurry down, not by his own stair, but by the one at the end of the corridor, which would take him past a certain door, number 7, in the first story. Every moment of the way, every step of the stair, offered a chance. Any instant the door might open, and in practice it often did. Out she would slip, noiselessly. The door would slam behind her. She would glide to the stairs. She would pass down ahead of him, with her hand up to her braids of hair, or else he would be in front of her, feel her gaze in his back, and experience a thrill as from an ant crawling down it. His bearing, of course, was that of a person unaware of her presence, leading a free and independent existence of his own. He would bury his hands in his pockets, walk with a swagger, cough an entirely unnecessary cough, and strike himself on the chest, anything to manifest his utter unconcern. On 2 occasions he refined yet further. Already seated at the table, he felt himself with both hands, and said with a fine show of irritation, "There, I've forgotten my handkerchief. That means I must trot back again to fetch it." And went back, to the end that he and she might meet on the way, since that afforded a keener throb than when she merely walked in front of or behind him. The first time he executed this maneuver, she measured him with her eyes from a distance, swept him from head to foot, quite bold and unblushing. Then, approaching nearer, turned away indifferently and passed him by, so that he got but little out of the démarche. The second time she stared him in the face without flinching, almost forbiddingly, even turning her head as they crossed, to follow him with her look. It went through our poor young friend like a knife. We need not pity him, for was it not all his own doing? But the encounter was gripping at the moment, and even more afterwards, for only in retrospect was he clear as to what had actually happened. He had never seen Frau Chauchat's face so close, so clear in all its details. He could have counted the tiny hairs that stood up from the braid she wore wreathed round her head. They were reddish blonde, with a metallic sheen. No more than a hand's breadth or so of space had been between his face and hers, whose outline and features, peculiar though they were, had been familiar to him as long as he could remember, and spoke to his very soul as nothing else could in all the world. It was an unusual face, and full of character, for only the unusual seems to us to have character. Its mystery and strangeness spoke of the unknown north, and it teased the curiosity because its proportions and characteristics were somehow not very easy to determine. Its keynote, probably, was the high, bony structure of the prominent cheekbones. They seemed to compress the eyes, which were unusually far apart and unusually level with the face, and squeeze them into a slightly oblique position, while at the same time they appeared responsible for the soft concavity of the cheek, and this, in turn, to result in the full curve of the slightly pouting lips. Then there were the eyes themselves, the narrow Kirghiz eyes, whose shape was yet to Hans Castorp a simple enchantment, and whose color was the gray-blue or blue-gray of distant mountains. They had the trick of sidewise, unseeing glance, which could sometimes melt them into the very hue of mystery and darkness. These eyes of Claudia, which had gazed so forbiddingly into his very face, and which so awfully resembled Pribislav hips in shape, expression, and color that they fairly frightened him. Resembled was not the word. They were the same eyes. The breadth, too, of the upper part of the face, the flattened nose, everything, even to the flush in the white skin, the healthy color of the cheek, which in Frau Chauchat's case, as in so many others, merely counterfeited health and was a superficial effect of the open-air cure. Everything was precisely Pribislav, and no differently would he have looked at Hans Castorp were they to meet again as of old in the school courtyard. It had been staggering in the extreme. Hans Castorp thrilled at the encounter, yet experienced a mounting uneasiness like that he felt when he realized how narrow was the proximity that enclosed him and the fair Russian. That the long-forgotten Pribislav hip should appear to him in the guise of Frau Chauchat and look at him with those Kirghiz eyes, this was to be immured, not with opportunity, but with the inevitable, the unescapable, to such an extent as to fill him with conflicting emotions. It was a situation rich in hope, yet heavy with dread. It gave our young friend a feeling of helplessness, and set in motion a vague instinct to cast about, to grope and feel for help or counsel. One after another, he mentally summoned up various people, the thought of whom might serve him as some sort of mental support. There was the good, the upright Joachim, firm as a rock, yet whose eyes in these past months had come to hold such a tragic shadow, and who had never used to shrug his shoulders, as he did so often now. Joachim, with the blue Peter in his pocket, as Frau Stor called the receptacle. When Hans Castorp thought of her hard, crabbed face, it made him shiver. Yes, there was Joachim, who kept constantly at Hofrat Baron's to let him get away and go down to the long-for-service in the plain, the flat land, as the healthy, normal world was called up here, with a faint yet perceptible nuance of contempt. Joachim served the cure single-mindedly, to the end that he might arrive sooner at his goal and save some of the time which those up here so wantonly flung away, served it unquestioningly for the sake of speedy recovery, but also, Hans Castorp detected, for the sake of the cure itself, which, after all, was a service, like another, and was not duty, wherever performed. Joachim invariably went upstairs after only a quarter-hour in the drawing-rooms, and this military precision of his was a prop to the civilian laxity of his cousin, who would otherwise be likely to loiter and profitably below, with his eye on the company in the small salon. But Hans Castorp was convinced there was another and private reason why Joachim withdrew so early. He had known it since the time he saw his cousin's face take on the mottled pallor and his mouth assume the pathetic twist. He perfectly understood. For Marussia was almost always there in the evening, laughter-loving Marussia, with the little ruby on her charming hand, the handkerchief with the orange scent, and the swelling bosom, tainted within. Hans Castorp comprehended that it was her presence which drove Joachim away, precisely because it so strongly, so fearfully drew him toward her. Was Joachim too immured, and even worse off than himself, in that he had 5 times a day to sit at the same table with Marussia and her orange-scented handkerchief? However that might be, it was clear that Joachim was preoccupied with his own troubles. The thought of him could afford his cousin no mental support. That he took refuge in daily flight was a credit to him, but that he had to flee was anything but reassuring to Hans Castorp, who even began to feel that Joachim's good example of faithful service of the cure and the initiation which he owed to his cousin's experience might have also their bad side. Hans Castorp had not been up here 3 weeks, but it seemed longer, and the daily routine which Joachim so piously observed had begun to take on, in his eyes, a character of sanctity, when, from the point of view of those up here, he considered life as lived down in the flatland. It seemed somehow queer and unnatural. He had grown skilled in the handling of his rugs and the art of making a proper bundle, a sort of mummy, of himself, when lying on his balcony on cold days. He was almost as skillful as Joachim, and yet, down below, there was no soul who knew aught of such an art or the practice of it. How strange, he thought, yet at the same moment wondered at himself for finding it strange, and there surged up again that uneasy sensation of groping for support. He thought of Hofrat Baron's and his professional advice bestowed sine pecunia that he should, while he was up here, order his life like the other patients, even to the taking of his temperature. He thought of Settembrini, and of how he had laughed at that same advice, and quoted something out of the magic flute. Did thinking of either of these two afford him any moral support? Hofrat Baron's was a white-haired man, old enough to be Hans Castorp's father. He was the head of the establishment, the highest authority, and it was of fatherly authority that the young man now felt an uneasy need. But no, it would not do. He could not think with childlike confidingness of the Hofrat. The physician had buried his wife up here, and been brought so low by grief as almost to lose his mind. Then he had stopped on, to be near her grave, and because he himself was somewhat infected. Was he sound again? Was he single-mindedly bent on making his patients whole, so they could go back to service in the world below? His cheeks had a purple hue. He looked fevered. That might be only the effect of the air up here. Hans Castorp, without fever, so far as he could judge without a thermometer, felt the same dry heat in his face, day in, day out. Of course, when one heard the Hofrat talk, one might easily conclude he had fever. There was something not quite right about it. It all sounded very jovial and lively, but on the whole forced, particularly when one thought of the purple cheeks and the watery eyes, which seemed to be still weeping for his wife. Hans Castorp recalled what Settembrini had said about the Hofrat's vices and chronic depression. That might have been malicious. It might have been sheer windiness. But he did not find it sustained or fortified him to think of Hofrat barons. Then there was Settembrini himself, of course, the chronic oppositionist, the windbag, the homo humanus, as he styled himself. Hans Castorp thought him well over. With his gift of the gab, his florid harangue on the combination of dullness and disease, and how he, Hans Castorp, had been taken to task for calling it a dilemma for the human intelligence. What about him? Would the thought of him be anyway efficacious? Hans Castorp recalled how several times, in the extraordinarily vivid dreams that visited his sleep in this place, he had taken umbrage at the dry and subtle smile curling the Italian's lip beneath the flowing mustache, how he had railed at him for a hand-organ man and tried to shove him away because he was a disturbing influence. But that was in his dreams. The waking Hans Castorp was no such matter, but a much less untrammeled person, not disinclined, either on the whole, to try out the influence upon himself of this novel human type, with its critical animus and acumen, despite the fact that he found the Italian both carping and garrulous. After all, Settembrini had called himself a pedagogue. Obviously, he was anxious to exercise influence, and Hans Castorp, for his part, fairly yearned to be influenced, though, of course, not to an extent which should cause him to pack his trunk and leave before his time, as Settembrini had in all seriousness proposed. Placet experere, he thought to himself, with a smile. So much Latin he had, without calling himself a homo humanus. The upshot was that he kept his eye on Settembrini, listened keenly and critically to what he had to say when they met on their prescribed walks to the bench on the mountainside, or down to the Platz, or wherever and whenever opportunity offered. Other occasions there were, too. For instance, at the end of a meal Settembrini would rise from table before anyone else and saunter across among the 7 tables, in his check trousers, a toothpick between his lips, to where the cousin sat. He did this in defiance of law and custom, standing there in a graceful attitude, with his legs crossed, talking and gesticulating with the toothpick. Or he would draw up a chair and sit down at the corner of the table, between Hans Castorp and the schoolmistress, or between Hans Castorp and Miss Robinson, and look on while they ate their pudding, which he seemed to have foregone. "May I beg for admission into this charmed circle?" he would say, shaking hands with the cousins and comprehending the rest of the table in a sweeping bow. My brewer over there, not to mention the despairing gaze of the breweress, but really this Her Magnus. Just now he has been delivering a discourse on folk psychology. Shall I tell you what he said? The fatherland, it is true, is one enormous barracks. But all the same it's got a lot of solid capacity. It's genuine. I wouldn't change it for the fine manners of the rest of them. What good are fine manners to me if I'm cheated right and left? And more of the same kind. I am at the end of my patience. And opposite me I have a poor creature, with churchyard roses blooming in her cheeks, an old maid from Siebenbergen, who never stops talking about her brother-in-law, a man we none of us either know or wish to know. I could stand it no longer. I shook their dust from my feet. I bolted. You raised your flag and took to your heels, Frau Storr stated. Precisely, shouted Settembrini. I fled with my flag. Ah, what an apt phrase. I see I have come to the right place. Nobody else here knows how to coin phrases like that. May I be permitted to inquire after the state of your health, Frau Storr? It was frightful to see Frau Storr preen herself. Good land, she said. It is always the same, you know yourself. 2 steps forward and 3 back. When you have been sitting here 5 months, along comes the old man and tucks on another 6. It is like the torment of Tantalus. You shove and think you are getting to the top. How delightful of you to give poor old Tantalus a new job and let him roll the stone uphill for a change. I call that true benevolence. But what are these mysterious reports I have been hearing of you, Frau Stor? There are tales going about, tales about doubles, astral bodies, and the like. Up to now I have lent them no credence, but this latest story puzzles me, I confess. I know you're poking fun at me. Not for an instant. I beg you to set my mind at rest about this dark side of your life. After that it will be time to jest. Last night, between 9:30 and 10, I was taking a little exercise in the garden. I looked up at the row of balconies. There was your light gleaming through the dark. You were performing your cure, led by the dictates of duty and reason. Thought I, there lies our charming invalid, obeying the rules of the house, for the sake of an early return to the arms of her waiting husband. And now what do I hear? That you were seen at that very hour at the courthouse in the cinematographo. Her Settembrini gave the word the Italian pronunciation, with the accent on the fourth syllable, and afterwards in the café, enjoying punch and kisses, and... Frau Stor wriggled and giggled into her serviette, nudged Joachim and the silent Dr. Blumenkohl in the ribs, winked with coy confidingness, and altogether gave a perfect exhibition of fatuous complacency. She was in the habit of leaving the light burning on her balcony and stealing off to seek distraction in the quarter below. Her husband, meanwhile, in Cannstatt, awaited her return. She was not the only patient who practiced this duplicity. And, went on Settembrini, that you were enjoying those kisses in the company of whom, do you think? In the company of Captain Miklosic from Bucharest. They say he wears a corset, but that is little to the point. I conjure you, madam, to tell me, have you a double? Was it your earthly part which lay there alone on your balcony, while your spirit reveled below, with Captain Miklosic and his kisses? Frau Stor wreathed and bridled as though she were being tickled. One asks oneself, had it not been better the other way about, Settembrini went on. You enjoying the kisses by yourself, and the rest cure with Captain Miklosic. Tee-hee, tittered Frau Stor. Have the ladies and gentlemen heard the latest? The Italian went on, without pausing for breath. Somebody has been flown away with by the devil. Or, to speak literally, by his mamma, a very determined lady. I quite took to her. It was young Schneermann, Anton Schneermann, who sat at Mademoiselle Kleefeld's table. You see, his place is empty. It will soon be filled up again. I am not worried about that. But Anton is off, on the wings of the wind, in the twinkling of an eye, wrapped away before he knew where he was. 16 years old, and had been up here a year and a half, with 6 months to go. But how did it happen? Who knows? Perhaps somebody dropped a little word to Madame his mother. Anyhow, she got wind of his goings-on. In back show, et ceteris. She appears unannounced on the scene, some 3 heads taller than I am, white-haired and exceeding wroth, fetches her Anton a couple of boxes on the ear, takes him by the collar, and puts him on the train. If he's going to the dogs, she says, he can do it just as well down below. And off they go. Everybody within earshot laughed. Her Settembrini had such a droll way of telling a story. Despite his contemptuous attitude toward the society of the place, he always knew everything that went on. He knew the name and circumstances of each patient. He knew that such and such a person had been operated on for rib resection, had it on the best authority that from the autumn onward no one with a temperature of more than 101.3 degrees would be admitted into the establishment. He told them how last night the little dog belonging to Madame Capitsolias from Mitylene stepped on the button of the electric signal on his mistress's night table and occasioned much commotion and running hither and yon, particularly because Madame Capitsolias had been found not alone, but in the society of Assessor Dusmund from Friedrichshagen. Even Dr. Blumenkohl had to laugh at that. Pretty Marussia well-nigh choked in her orange-scented handkerchief, and Frau Stor yelled with laughter, holding her breast with both hands. But to the cousins Ludovico Settembrini talked of himself and his early life, whether on the walks they took together, or during the evening in the salon, or perhaps in the dining-room itself, after a meal, when most of the patients had left and the 3 sat together at their end of the table, while the waitresses cleared away and Hans Castorp smoked his Maria Mancini, which in the 3rd week had regained a little of its savor. He was critical of what he heard, and often he felt put off. Yet he listened receptively to the Italian's talk, for it opened to his understanding a world utterly new and strange. Settembrini spoke of his grandfather, a Milanese lawyer, but even more a patriot, with something of the political agitator and orator and journalist to boot. He too, like his grandson, had always been in the opposition, though he had been able to perform his role upon a larger stage than had Ludovico. The latter remarked with some bitterness that his own activities had been confined to heckling and castigating the follies and frailties of the guests at the International Sanatorium Berghof, and to protesting against them in the name of the free and joyous human spirit. But his grandfather had had his finger in the forming of governments. He had conspired against Austria and the Holy Alliance, which had dismembered his native land and then held it in the heavy bond of servitude. He had been a zealous member of certain secret societies that had spread over Italy. A Carbonaro, Settembrini explained, suddenly dropping his voice, as though it might still be dangerous to utter the word. In fact, from his grandson's narrative, the two hearers got a picture of a dark and tempest-tossed figure, a ringleader, political agitator, and conspirator. Despite all their pains, they did not quite succeed in hiding a feeling of mistrust, even repulsion. True, the circumstances had been extraordinary. What they heard had happened long ago, almost 100 years. It was history, and they were familiar in theory, particularly from ancient history, with the traditional figure of the tyrant-hater and liberator such as they now heard of, though they had never dreamed of being brought into actual human contact with him, like this. Settembrini's grandfather, so they were told, united with his conspiratorial zeal a profound love for his native land, which it was his dream to see free and united. Indeed, it was out of this very combination, as a natural consequence, that his revolutionary activities flowed, and how strange this mingling of rebellion and patriotism seemed to the cousins, in whose minds an abiding sense of order was on an equal footing with their love of country. But they privately admitted, nonetheless, that at that time, and in that situation, it might have been conceivably possible that rebellion should go paired with civic virtue, and law-abidingness lie down with lazy indifference to the public weal. But grandfather Giuseppe had been not only an Italian patriot. He had been fellow citizen and brother-in-arms to any people struggling for its liberties. Thus, after the shipwreck of a certain plot hatched in Turin for the overthrow of the military and civil government, a plot in which he had been deeply involved, he had escaped by a hair's breadth the clutches of Metternich's hirelings, and spent the time of his exile fighting and bleeding, first in Spain for the cause of constitutionalism, then in Greece for the independence of the Hellenic peoples. It was in Greece that Settembrini's father had seen the light, which probably accounted for his being a humanist and lover of classical antiquity. His mother had been of German stock. Settembrini had married her in Switzerland and taken her about with him in his further adventurous career. He had been allowed, after 10 years of exile, to return to Milan, where he had practiced his profession, without for a moment ceasing to labor, with voice and pen, in verse and prose, for the establishment of a united republic, and to draw up subversive programs characterized by dictatorial ardor, in which were promulgated in the clearest style the unification of the liberated people and the attainment of general felicity. One detail mentioned by the grandson made a profound impression upon Hans Castorp. Grandfather Giuseppe, to the day of his death, wore black, in token, he said, of his mourning for the state of the fatherland, languishing in misery and servitude. Hans Castorp, at this piece of information, thought of his own grandfather, as he had once or twice before during Settembrini's narrative. He too, for as long as his grandson had known him, wore black clothes. But for how different a reason? Hans Lorenz Castorp had worn the quaint old fashion to indicate his oneness with a bygone time and his essential lack of sympathy with the present, worn it up to the end of his days, when he had returned in death to his true and adequate presentment, with his starched ruff. Certainly, these were two strikingly different kinds of grandfather. Hans Castorp pondered, his eyes fixed in a stare, cautiously shaking his head in a way that might as well be taken for a sign of admiration for Giuseppe Settembrini as for the opposite. He honorably refrained from judging what he did not understand, but simply made mental note of the contrast and let it go at that. He could see the narrow head of old Hans Lorenz, as it bent musing over the pale gold rim of the christening basin, that symbol of the passing and the abiding, of continuity through change. He had his mouth open. Hans Castorp knew the words "great, great, great" were about to issue from it, the somber syllables which always reminded him of places where one walked with bent head and reverent gait. And then he saw Giuseppe Settembrini, with a tricolor on his arm, waving his saber and breathing a vow to heaven with dark gaze flung aloft, as he stormed the heights of despotism at the head of a liberty-loving host. Well, he thought, each of them had his fine and splendid side. He made the greater effort to be fair, because he knew himself to be partisan, on personal or partly personal grounds. For Grandfather Settembrini had fought to obtain political rights, whereas the other grandfather, or his ancestors, had originally had all the rights, and the scoundrels had taken them away from him, in the course of the centuries, by violence or pettifoggery. So both grandfathers had worn mourning, the one in the north and the one in the south, and both in the same idea, namely, to put a great gulf between them and the evil present. But whereas the one had assumed it in token of his pious reverence for the past and the dead, to whom he felt himself with his whole being to belong, the other had worn it as a sign of rebellion, in the name of progress, and in a spirit of hostility toward the past. Yes, these were two different worlds. As Settembrini talked, and Hans Castorp stood, as it were, between them and cast his critical eye upon one and upon the other, they called back to his conscious mind a scene from his own past life. He saw himself rowing on a lake in Holstein, one late summer evening. The sun was down, the almost full moon rising above the bushes that bordered the lake. He rowed alone and slowly over the quiet waters, gazing to right and left at a scene fantastic as any dream. In the west it was still broad day, with a fixed and glassy air, but in the east he looked into a moonlit landscape, wreathed in the magic of rising mists and equally convincing to his bewildered sense. The strange combination lasted some brief quarter-hour before the balance finally settled in favor of night and the moon. All that time Hans Castorp's dazzled eyes went shifting in lively amazement from one scene to the other, from day to night and back again to day. The picture returned to him now. At the same time the thought crossed his mind that lawyer Settembrini could scarcely have been much of a jurist, considering his other occupations and the extended sphere of his activities. His grandson asseverated, however, and Hans Castorp found it credible, that the grandfather had been from early childhood down to the last day of his life inspired by the fundamental principle of justice. Our hero, all heavy-headed as he was and organically preoccupied by the 6-course Berghoff meal he had just eaten, made an effort to understand what Settembrini meant when he called this principle the source and fount of liberty and progress. Progress, up to now, had to do, in Hans Castorp's mind, with such things as the 19th-century development of cranes and lifting tackle. He was accordingly gratified to learn that Grandfather Settembrini had not underestimated the importance of such matters. Of course, his own grandfather hadn't either. The Italian paid a tribute to the native land of his two listeners for the inventions of gunpowder, whereby the armor of feudalism had been thrown on the scrap heap, and the printing press, which had made possible the democratic propagation of ideas, and the propagation of democratic ideas, which were one and the same. For these good gifts he praised Germany, praised her for her past, but awarded his own country the palm, because she had been the first to unfurl the banner of freedom, culture, and enlightenment, at a time when all other lands were wrapped in the darkness of superstition and slavery. Yet in paying due honor, as upon their first meeting, at the bench by the watercourse, to commerce and technology, Hans Castorp's own field, Settembrini apparently did so not for the sake of these forces themselves, but purely with reference to their significance for the ethical development of mankind. For such a significance, he declared, he joyfully ascribed to them. Technical progress, he said, gradually subjugated nature by developing roads and telegraphs, minimizing climatic differences, and by the means of communication which it created proved itself the most reliable agent in the task of drawing together the peoples of the earth, of making them acquainted with each other, of building bridges to compromise, of destroying prejudice, of, actually, bringing about the universal brotherhood of man. Humanity had sprung from the depths of fear, darkness, and hatred, but it was emerging. It was moving onward and upward, toward a goal of fellow feeling and enlightenment, of goodness and joyousness. And upon this path, he said, the industrial arts were the vehicle conducive to the greatest progress. But all this made a confused impression on Hans Castorp. Her Settembrini seemed to bring together in a single breath categories which in the young man's mind had heretofore been as the poles asunder, for example, technology and morals. Positively, he made the statement that Christ had been the first to proclaim the principle of equality and union, that the printing press had propagated the doctrine, and that finally the French Revolution had elevated it into a law. All which our poor young friend found very muddling. He scarce knew why, though the feeling was definite enough in all conscience, and though her Settembrini had couched his thought in the clearest and roundest of periods. Once, the Italian went on, once only in his life, and that in his early manhood, had his grandfather known what it was to feel profound joy. That was at the time of the Paris July Revolution. He had gone about proclaiming to all and sundry that some day men would place those 3 days alongside the 6 days of creation, and reverence them alike. Hans Castorp felt utterly dumbfounded. Involuntarily, he slapped the table with his hand. To compare those 3 summer days of the year 1830, when the Parisians had taken unto themselves a new constitution, to the 6 in which God had divided the land from the water and created the lights in the firmament of heaven, as well as flowers, trees, birds, and fishes, and all other living things, that seemed to him to be going too far. He talked it over later with Cousin Joachim, and gave clear expression to his opinion that it really was pretty thick, that he, Hans Castorp, for his part, found it positively offensive, but still open-minded. At least in the sense that he enjoyed the experiment he was making, he restrained the objections which his sense of fitness would have raised against the Settembrinian scheme of things. Restrained them on the theory that what seemed sedition to him might to another seem dauntless courage, and what he called bad taste might have been, in that far-off time and circumstance, but a display of the noble excesses of a high-hearted nature. For instance, when Grandfather Settembrini called the barricades the people's throne, and talked about dedicating the burgher's pike on the altar of humanity. Hans Castorp knew, without putting it into so many words, why he lent an ear to his Settembrini. Partly it was out of a sense of duty, though also out of that holiday mood of taking everything as it came, rejecting nothing, in the knowledge that in another day or so he would spread his wings and fly back to the wonted order of things. Yes, he knew it was largely the promptings of conscience to which he hearkened. To be precise, the promptings of a conscience not altogether easy. As he sat listening to the Italian, one leg crossed over the other, drawing at his Maria Mancini, or when the 3 of them climbed the hill from the English quarter. 2 principles, according to the Settembrinian cosmogony, were in perpetual conflict for possession of the world: force and justice, tyranny and freedom, superstition and knowledge, the law of permanence and the law of change, of ceaseless fermentation, issuing in progress. One might call the first the Asiatic, the second the European principle, for Europe was the theater of rebellion, the sphere of intellectual discrimination and transforming activity, whereas the East embodied the conception of quiescence and immobility. There was no doubt as to which of the 2 would finally triumph. It would be the power of enlightenment, the power that made for rational advance and development. For human progress snatched up ever more peoples with it on its brilliant course. It conquered more and more territory in Europe itself, and was already pressing Asiawards. Much still remained to be done. Sublime exertions were still demanded from those spirits who had received the light. Then only the day would come when thrones would crash and outworn religions crumble, in those remaining countries of Europe which had not already enjoyed the blessings of 18th-century enlightenment, nor yet of an upheaval like 1789. But the day would come, Settembrini said, with his suave smile. It would come, he repeated, if not on the wings of doves, then on the pinions of eagles, and dawn would break over Europe, the dawn of universal brotherhood, in the name of justice, science, and human reason. It would bring in its train a new holy alliance, the alliance of the democratic peoples of Europe, in opposition to that other holy alliance, the thrice infamous organ of princes and cabinets, which Grandfather Giuseppe had personally regarded as his deadly foe. In a word, it would bring in its train the republic of the world. But before that could happen, the Asiatic principle must be met and crushed in its very stronghold and vital center, that was to say, in Vienna. Austria must be crushed and dismembered, first to take vengeance for the past, and second to lead in the new law of justice, with truth on earth. Hans Castorp did not care for this last drift in her Settembrini's sonorous flow of words. He mistrusted it. It sounded too much like a personal or national animus. As for Joachim Ziemßen, whenever the Italian fell into this vein, he scowled and turned away his head, or sought to create a diversion by saying it was time for the rest cure. Neither did Hans Castorp feel obliged to listen when the conversation took these devious paths. They clearly fell outside the limits within which his conscience prompted him to profit by his Settembrini's words. Yet conscience still urged him to continue in the effort, so clearly that often, as opportunity arose, he would even invite the Italian to discourse on the subject of his ideas. Those ideas, ideals, and efforts of the aspiring will were, Settembrini said, traditional in his family. He inherited them. Grandfather, son, and grandson, each in his turn, had dedicated to them their entire lives and all their spiritual energy. The father in his own way had done so no less than grandfather Giuseppe. True, he had not been a political agitator or active combatant in the cause of freedom, but a quiet and sensitive scholar, a humanist sitting at his writing desk. But what, after all, was humanism if not love of humankind, and by that token also political activity, rebellion against all that tended to defile or degrade our conception of humanity? He had been accused of exaggerating the importance of form, but he who cherished beauty of form did so because it enhanced human dignity, whereas the Middle Ages, in striking contrast, had been sunk not only in superstitious hostility to the human spirit, but also in a shameful formlessness. From the very beginning, he had defended the right of the human being to his earthly interests, to liberty of thought and joy in life, and insisted that we could safely leave heaven to take care of itself. Humanism. Had not Prometheus been the earliest humanist, and was he not identical with the Satan hymned by Carducci? Ah, if the cousins had only heard that archenemy of the Church, at Bologna, pouring the vials of his sarcasm upon the Christian sentimentalism of the Romanticismo, upon Manzoni's Inni Sacri, upon the shadows and moonlight poetry of the Romantic movement, which he had compared to Luna, heaven's pallid nun. For Bacco, this was a joy to listen to. And they ought to have heard Carducci interpret Dante, celebrating him as the citizen of a great city-state who had spoken out against asceticism and the negation of life, and on the side of the world-transforming and reforming deed. It was not the sickly and mystagogic figure of Beatrice, which the poet had celebrated under the name of Donna Gentile e Pietosa. Rather, it had been his wife, who represented in the poem the principle of worldly knowledge and practical workaday life. Thus Hans Castorp came to hear something about Dante, and certainly from the lips of authority. He was not too much inclined to believe implicitly all Settembrini said. He considered him too much of a windbag for that. Still, it was an interesting conception, this of Dante as the wide-awake citizen of a great metropolis. And now Settembrini went on to speak of himself, and to explain how the tendencies of his immediate forebears, the political from his grandfather, the humanistic from his father, had united in his own person to produce the writer and independent man of letters. For literature was after all nothing else than the combination of humanism and politics, a conjunction the more immediate in that humanism itself was politics and politics humanism. Hans Castorp did his best at this point to listen and comprehend, in the hope of finally learning wherein had consisted the crass ignorance of Magnus the Brewer, and finding out what else literature actually was, above and beyond beautiful characters. Settembrini asked his audience whether they had ever heard of Brunetto Latini, a Florentine notary, who about the year 1250 had written a book on the subject of the virtues and the vices. He it was who had sharpened the wits of the Florentines, taught them the art of language, and how to guide their state according to the rules of politics. There you have it, gentlemen, there you have it. Settembrini cried with ardor, and enlarged upon the cult of the word, the art of eloquence, which he called the triumph of the human genius. For the word was the glory of mankind. It alone imparted dignity to life. Not only was humanism bound up with the word and with literature, but so also was humanity itself, man's ancient dignity and manly self-respect. "You heard, didn't you?" Hans Castorp said later to his cousin. "You heard him say that literature is a question of beautiful words?" I spotted it directly, from which it followed that politics, too, is bound up with the word. Or, rather, it followed directly from the unity that subsisted between humanity and literature, for the beautiful word begets the beautiful deed. 200 years ago, Settembrini said, you had a poet in your country, a magnificent old chatterbox who set great store in good handwriting because he thought it must induce a good style. He should have gone a step further and said that a good style would lead to good deeds, Settembrini added. For writing well was almost the same as thinking well, and thinking well was the next thing to acting well. All moral discipline, all moral perfection derived from the soul of literature, from the soul of human dignity, which was the moving spirit of both humanity and politics. Yes, they were all one and the same force, one and the same idea, and all of them could be comprehended in one single word. This word? It was already familiar to their ears. Yet he would wager the cousins had never before rightly grasped its meaning and its majesty. The word was civilization. And as Settembrini brought it out, he flung his small, yellow-skinned right hand in the air, as though proposing a toast. Well, all that young Hans Castorp found worth listening to, not precisely overwhelming, of a value largely experimental but still worth listening to. He said as much to Joachim Ziemßen later, but Joachim had his thermometer in his mouth and could not reply to his cousin, nor had he afterwards leisure, when, on taking it out, he read the figure and entered it in his notebook. But Hans Castorp good-naturedly took cognizance of Settembrini's point of view and tested by it his own inner experiences, from which self-examination it principally appeared that the waking man has an advantage over the sleeping and dreaming one. For whereas the sleeping Hans Castorp had more than once upbraided the organ grinder to his face and done his utmost to drive him away because he felt him a disturbing influence, the waking one lent him an attentive ear and made an honest effort to minimize the opposition which his mentor's ideas and conceptions persistently aroused in him. For it cannot be denied that there was such opposition, some of it such as he must always have felt from the very beginning, the rest arising from the particular situation and his partly vicarious, partly secret and personal experiences among those up here. What a creature is man! How widely his conscience betrays him! How easy it is for him to think he hears, even in the voice of duty, a license to passion. Hans Castorp listened to Settembrini out of a sense of duty and fairness, in the idea of hearing both sides. With the best of intentions, he tested the latter's views on the subject of the Republic, reason, and the bellow style. He was entirely receptive. And all the while he was finding it more and more permissible to give his thoughts and dreams free rein in another and quite opposite direction. Indeed, to give expression to all that we suspect or divine, we think it not unlikely that Hans Castorp hearkened to Settembrini's discourse in order to get from his own conscience an indulgence which otherwise might not have been forthcoming. But what, or who, was it that drew down the other side of the scales, when weighed over against patriotism, belles lettres, and the dignity of man? It was Klavdia Chowchat, Kyrgyz-eyed, relaxed, and tainted within, when he thought of her, though thinking is far too tame a word to characterize the impulse that turned all his being in her direction. It was as though he were sitting again in his boat on the lake in Holstein, looking with dazzled eyes from the glassy daylight of the western shore to the mist and moonbeams that wrapped the eastern heavens. The thermometer. Hans Castorp's week here ran from Tuesday to Tuesday, for on a Tuesday he had arrived. 2 or 3 days before, he had gone down to the office and paid his second weekly bill, a modest account of around 160 francs, modest and cheap enough, even without taking into consideration the nature of some of the advantages of a stay up here, advantages priceless in themselves, though for that very reason they could not be included in the bill. And even without counting extras like the fortnightly concert and Dr. Krokowski's lectures, which might conceivably have been included, the sum of 160 francs represented simply and solely the actual hospitality extended by the Berghof to Hans Castorp. his comfortable lodgment, and his 5 stupendous meals. "It isn't much. It is rather cheap than otherwise," remarked the guest to the old inhabitant. "You cannot complain of being overcharged up here. You need around 650 francs a month for board and lodging, treatment included. Let us assume that you spend another 30 francs for tips, if you are decent and like to have friendly faces about you. That makes 680.
Good.
Of course, I know there are fixed fees and other sorts of small expenses. Toilet articles, tobacco, drives, and excursions. Now, and then a bill for shoes or clothing. Very good. But all that won't bring it up to 1,000 francs, say what you like. Not 800 even. That isn't 10,000 francs a year. Certainly not more. That is what it costs you." "Mental arithmetic very fair," Joachim said. "I never knew you were such a shot at doing sums in your head. And how broad-minded of you to calculate it by the year like that. You've learned something since you've been up here. But your figure is too high. I don't smoke, and I certainly don't expect to buy any suits while I am here. Thank you." "Then it would be lower still," Hans Castorp answered, rather confused. Why, indeed, he should have included tobacco and a new wardrobe in his calculation of Joachim's expenses is a puzzle. But for the rest, his brilliant display of arithmetic had simply been so much dust thrown in his cousin's eyes. For here, as elsewhere, his mental processes were rather slow than fast, and the truth is that a previous calculation with pencil and paper underlay his present facility. One night on his balcony, for he even took the evening cure out of doors now, like the rest, a sudden thought had struck him, and he had got out of his comfortable chair to fetch pencil and paper. As the result of some simple figuring, he concluded that his cousin, or, speaking generally, a patient at the Berghof, would need 12,000 francs a year to cover the sum total of his expenses. Thus he amused himself by establishing the fact that he, Hans Castorp, could amply afford to live up here, if he chose, being a man of 18 or 19,000 francs yearly income. He had, as we have said, paid his second weekly bill 3 days before, and accordingly found himself in the middle of the third and last week of his appointed stay. The coming Sunday, as he remarked to himself and to his cousin, would see the performance of another of the fortnightly concerts, and the Monday another lecture by Dr. Krokowski. Then on Tuesday or Wednesday, he would be off, and Joachim would be left up here alone. Poor Joachim, for whom Rhadamanthus would prescribe God knew how many more months. Already there came a shade over his gentle black eyes whenever Hans Castorp's swiftly approaching departure was spoken of. Where, in heaven's name, had the holiday gone? It had rushed past, it had flown, and left one wondering how. For after all, 3 weeks, 21 days is a considerable stretch of time, too long at least for one to see the end at the beginning. And now, on a sudden, there remained of it no more than a miserable 3 or 4 days, nothing worth mentioning. They would, it was true, comprehend the lecture and the concert, those 2 recurrent variations in the weekly program, and, thus weighted, might move a little more slowly. But on the other hand, they would be taken up with packing and leave-taking. 3 weeks up here was as good as nothing at all. They had all told him so in the beginning. The smallest unit of time was the month, Settembrini had said, and as Hans Castorp's stay was less than that, it amounted to nothing. It was a weekend visit, as Hofrat Behrens put it. Had the swift flight of time up here anything to do with the uniformly accelerated rate of organic combustion? At any rate, here was a consoling thought for Joachim during his 5 remaining months, in case he really got off with 5. But Hans Castorp felt that during these 3 weeks they ought to have paid more attention, to have kept better watch, as Joachim did in his daily measurings, during which the 7 minutes seemed like a quite considerable stretch of time. Hans Castorp grieved for his cousin, reading in his eyes his pain at the approaching parting. He felt the strongest possible sympathy at the thought of the poor chaps having to stop on up here, when he himself was down in the flatland, helping bring the nations together through the development of commerce and communications. His own regret was at times so lively as to burn in his breast and cause him to doubt whether he would have the heart, when the time came, to leave Joachim alone. And this vicarious suffering was probably the reason why he himself referred less and less to his impending departure. It was Joachim who came back to it, for Hans Castorp, moved by native tact and delicacy, seemed to wish to forget it up to the last moment. At least, Joachim said more than once in these days, "Let us hope it has done you good to be up here, and that you will feel the benefit when you are at home again." "I'll remember you to everybody," Hans Castorp responded, "and say you are coming back in 5 months at the outside." Done me good? If it has done me good to be up here? I should like to think so. Some improvement must surely have taken place, even in this short time. I have received a great many new impressions, new in every sense of the word. Very stimulating, but a good deal of strain too, physically and mentally. I have not at all the feeling of having really got acclimatized, which would certainly be the first necessary step toward improvement. Maria, thank goodness, is her old self. For several days now, I have been able to get the aroma. But my handkerchief still becomes red from time to time when I use it, and this damned heat in my face, and these idiotic palpitations, I shall apparently have them up to the last minute. No, it seems I can't talk about being acclimatized. How could I, either in so short a time? It would take longer than this to overcome the change of atmosphere and adjust oneself perfectly to the unusual conditions, so that a real recovery could begin, and I should commence to put on flesh. It is too bad. It was certainly a mistake not to have given myself more time, for of course I could have had it. I have the feeling that once I am at home again, I shall need to sleep 3 weeks on and to get rested from the rest I've had. That shows you how tired I sometimes feel. And now, to cap the climax, I get this catarrh. It looked, in fact, as though Hans Castorp would return home in possession of a first-class cold. He had caught it probably in the rest cure and, again probably, in the evening rest cure, which for almost a week now he had been taking in the balcony, despite the long spell of cold, wet weather. He was aware that weather of this kind was not recognized as bad. Such a conception hardly existed up here, where the most inclement conceivable went unheeded and had no terrors for anyone. With the easy adaptability of youth, which suits itself to any environment, Hans Castorp had begun to imitate this indifference. It might rain in bucketfuls, but the air was not supposed to be the more damp for that, nor was it, in all probability, for the dry heat in the face persisted, as though after drinking wine, or sitting in an overheated room. And however cold it got, the radiators were never heated unless it snowed, so it was of no avail to take refuge in one's chamber, since it was quite as comfortable on the balcony, when one lay in one's excellent chair, wrapped in a paletot and 2 good camel's hair rugs put on according to the ritual. As comfortable? It was incomparably more so. It was, in Hans Castorp's reasoned judgment, a state of life which more appealed to him than any in all his previous experience, so far as he could remember. He did not propose to be shaken in this view for any carbonaro or quill driver in existence, no matter how many malicious and equivocal jokes he made on the subject of the horizontal. Especially he liked it in the evening, when with his little lamp on the stand beside him, and his long-lost and now restored Maria alight between his lips, he enjoyed the ineffable excellencies of his reclining chair. True, his nose felt frozen, and the hands that held his book, he was still reading ocean steamships, were red and cramped from the cold. He looked through the arch of his loggia over the darkening valley, jeweled with clustered or scattering lights, and listened to the music that drifted up nearly every evening for almost an hour. There was a concert below, and he could hear, pleasantly subdued by the distance, familiar operatic selections, snatches from Carmen, Illinois Trovatore, Freischütz, or well-built, facile waltzes. Marches so spirited that he could not help keeping time with his head, and gay mazurkas. Mazurka? No, Marussia was her name, Marussia of the Little Ruby. And in the next loggia, behind the thick wall of milky glass, lay Joachim, with whom Hans Castorp exchanged a word now and then, low-toned, out of consideration for the other horizontalers. Joachim was as well off in his loggia as Hans Castorp in his, though, being entirely unmusical, he could not take the same pleasure in the concerts. Too bad. He was probably studying his Russian primer instead. But Hans Castorp let ocean steamships fall on the coverlet and gave himself up to the music. He contemplated with such inward gratification the translucent depth of a musical invention full of individuality and charm that he thought with nothing but hostility of Settembrini and the irritating things he had said about music, that it was politically suspect was the worst. and little better than the remark of grandfather Giuseppe about the July Revolution and the 6 days of creation. Joachim, though he could not partake of Hans Castorp's pleasure in the music, nor the pungent gratification purveyed by Maria, lay as snugly ensconced as his cousin. The day was at an end. For the time everything was at an end, there would be no more emotional alarms, no more strain on the heart muscles. But equally, there was the assurance that tomorrow it would begin all over again, all the favoring probabilities afforded by propinquity and the household regimen. And this pleasing combination of snugness and confident hope, together with the music and the restored charms of Maria, made the evening cure state almost amounting to beatification for young Hans Castorp. All which had not prevented the guest and novice from catching a magnificent cold, either in the evening rest cure or elsewhere. He felt the onset of catarrh, with oppression in the frontal sinus and inflamed uvula. He could not breathe easily through the passage provided by nature. The air struck cold and painfully as it struggled through and caused constant coughing. His voice took on overnight the tonal quality of a hollow bass, the worse for strong drink. According to him, he had not closed an eye, his parched throat making him start up every 5 minutes from his pillow. Very vexatious, Joachim said, and most unfortunate. Colds, are not the thing at all up here. They're not ricus. The authorities don't admit their existence. The official attitude is that the dryness of the air entirely prevents them. If you were a patient, you would certainly fall foul of Behrens if you went to him and said you had a cold. But it is a little different with a guest. You have a right to have a cold if you wanna. It would be good if we could check the catarrh. There are things to do down below, but here, I doubt if anyone would take enough interest in it. It is not advisable to fall ill up here. You aren't taken any notice of. It's an old story, but you are coming to hear it at the end. When I was new up here, there was a lady who complained of her ear for a whole week and told everybody how she suffered. Behrens finally looked at it. "Make yourself quite easy, madam," he said. "It is not tubercular." That was an end of the matter. Well, we must see what can be done. I will speak to the bathing master early tomorrow morning, when he comes to my room. Then it will go through the regular channels, and perhaps something will come of it. Thus Joachim and the regular channels proved reliable. On Friday, after Hans Castorp returned from the morning round, there was a knock at his door, and he was vouchsafed the pleasure of personal acquaintance with Fräulein von Meilendonck, Frau Director, as she was called. Up to now he had seen this overoccupied person only from a distance, crossing the corridor from one patient's room to another, or when she had popped up for a moment in the dining room and he had been aware of her raucous voice. But now he himself was the object of her visit. His catarrh had fetched her. She knocked a short, bony knock, entered almost before he had said "come in," and then, upon the threshold, bent round to make sure of the number of the room. 34. She croaked briskly.
"Right."
"Well, young un on me dit, que vous avez pris Freud. Wi cachetja, prostudilist, lay a raffordado. I hear you have caught a cold. What language do you speak?" "Oh, I see. You are young Ziemson's guest. I am due in the operating room. Somebody there to be chloroformed, and he has just been eating bean salad. I have to have my eyes everywhere. Well, young un, so you have a cold." Hans Castorp was taken aback by this mode of address, in the mouth of a dame of ancient lineage. In her rapid speech she slurred over her words, all the time restlessly moving her head about with a circular action, the nose sniffingly in the air, the motion of a caged beast of prey. Her freckled right hand, loosely closed with the thumb uppermost, she held in front of her and waved it to and fro on the wrist, as though to say, "Come, make haste, don't attend to what I say, but say what you have to and let me be off." She was in the 40s, of stunted growth, without form or comeliness, clad in a belted pinaforish garment of clinical white, with a garnet cross on her breast. Sparse, reddish hair showed beneath the white coif of her profession. Her eyes were a watery blue, with inflamed lids, and one of them, as a finishing touch, had a sty in a well-advanced stage of development in the corner. Their glance was unsteady and flickering. Her nose was turned up, her mouth like a frog's, and furnished to boot with a wry and protruding lower lip, which she used like a shovel to get her words out. Hans Castorp looked at her, and all the modest and confiding friendliness native to him spoke in his eyes. "What sort of cold is it, repeated the directress. She seemed to try to concentrate her gaze and make it penetrate, but it slipped aside. "We don't care for such colds. Are you subject to them? Your cousin has been too, hasn't he? How old are you? 24? Yes, it's the age. And so you come up here and get a cold? There ought not to be any talk about colds up here. That sort of twaddle belongs down below." It was fearsome to see how she shoveled out this word with her lower lip. "You have a beautiful bronchial catarrh, that is plain." Again she made that curious effort to pierce him with her gaze, and again she could not hold it steady. But catarrhs are not caused by cold. They come from an infection, which one takes from being in a receptive state. So the question is, are we dealing with a harmless infection or with something more serious? Everything else is twaddle. It is possible that your receptivity inclines to the harmless kind, she went on, and looked at him with her overripe stye. He knew not how. "Here, I will give you a simple antiseptic. It may do good." And she took a small packet out of the leather bag that hung from her girdle. "It was Formament, but you look flushed, as though you had fever." She never stopped trying to fix him with her gaze, and always the eyes glided off to one side. "Have you measured?" He answered in the negative. "Why not?" she asked, and her protruding lower lip hung in the air after she spoke. He made no answer. The poor youth was still young. He had never got over his schoolboy shyness. He sat, so to speak, on his bench, did not know the answer, and took refuge in dumbness. "Perhaps you never do take your temperature?" "Oh, yes, Frau Director, when I have fever." "My dear child, one takes it in the first instance to see whether one has fever. According to you, you have none now." "I can't tell, Frau Director. I cannot really tell the difference. Ever since I came up here, I have been a little hot and shivery." "Aha! And where is your thermometer?" "I haven't one with me, Frau Director." "Why should I? I am not ill. I am only up here on a visit." "Tomirat, did you send for me because you weren't ill?" "No," he laughed politely. "It was because I caught a little cold. We've often seen such colds." "Here, young un," she said, and rummaged again in her bag. She brought out 2 longish leather cases, one red and one black, and put them on the table. "This one is 3 francs 50, the other 5. The 5-franc one is better, of course. It will last you a lifetime if you take care of it." Smiling, he took up the red case and opened it. The glass instrument lay like a jewel within, fitted neatly into its red velvet groove. The degrees were marked by red strokes, the tenths by black ones. The figures were in red, and the tapering end was full of glittering quicksilver. The columns stood below blood heat. Hans Castorp knew what was due to himself and his upbringing. "I will take this one," he said, not even looking at the other. "The one at 5 francs. May I?" "Then that's settled," croaked the directress. "I see you don't niggle over important purchases. No hurry, it will come on the bill. Give him to me. We'll drive him right down." She took the thermometer out of his hand and plunged it several times through the air until the mercury stood below 95 degrees. "He'll soon climb up again," she said. "Here is your new acquisition. You know how we do it up here? Straight under the tongue, 7 minutes, 4 times a day, and shut the lips well over it. Well, young un, I must get on. Good luck." And she was out at the door. Hans Castorp bowed her out, then stood by the table, staring from the door through which she had disappeared to the instrument she had left behind. So that, he thought, was Directress von Meilendonck. Settembrini doesn't care for her, and certainly she has her unpleasant side. The stye isn't pretty, but of course she does not have it all the time. But why does she call me young un like that? Rather rude and familiar, seems to me. So she has sold me a thermometer. I suppose she always has 1 or 2 in her pocket. They are to be had everywhere here, Joachim said, even in shops where you would least expect it. But I didn't need to take the trouble to buy it. It just fell into my lap. He took the article out of its case, looked at it, and walked restlessly up and down the room. His heart beat strong and rapidly. He looked toward the open balcony door and considered seeking counsel of Joachim, but thought better of it and paused again by the table. He cleared his throat by way of testing his voice. Then he coughed. "Yes," he said. "I must see if I have the fever that goes with the cold." Quickly he put the thermometer in his mouth, the mercury beneath the tongue, so that the instrument stuck slantingly upwards from his lips. He closed them firmly, that no air might get in. Then he looked at his wristwatch. It was 6 minutes after the half-hour, and he began to wait for the 7 minutes to pass. Not a second too long, he thought, and not one too short. They can depend on me in both directions. They needn't give me a silent sister, like that Ottilie Nefer Settembrini told us of. He walked about, pressing down the thermometer with his tongue. The time crept on. The terms seemed unending. When he looked at his watch, 2.5 minutes had passed, and he had feared the 7 minutes were already more than up. He did 1,000 things, picked up objects about the room and set them down again, walked out on the balcony, taking care that his cousin should not notice his presence, and looked at the landscape of this high valley, now so familiar to him in all its phases, with its horns, its crests and walls, with the projecting wing of the bramble, the ridge of which sloped steeply down to the valley, its flanks covered with rugged undergrowth, with its formations on the right side of the valley, whose names were no less familiar than the others, and the Altinwand, which from this point appeared to close in the valley on the south. He looked down on the garden beds and paths, the grotto and the silver fir. He listened to the murmur that rose from the rest hall, and he returned to his room, settling the thermometer under his tongue. Then, with a motion of the arm which drew away the sleeve from his wrist, he brought the forearm before his eyes and found that by dint of pushing and shoving, pulling and hauling, he had managed to get rid of full 6 minutes. The last one he spent standing in the middle of the room, but then, unfortunately, he let his thoughts wander and fell into a doze, so that the 60 seconds flew by on the wings of the wind, and, when he looked again, the 8th minute was already past its first quarter. It doesn't really matter, so far as the result is concerned, he thought, and, tearing the instrument out of his mouth, he stared at it in confusion. He was not immediately the wiser. The gleam of the quicksilver fell with the reflection of the glass case where the light struck it, and he could not tell whether the mercury had ascended the whole length of the column, or whether it was not there at all. He brought the instrument close to his eyes, turned it hither and thither, all to no purpose. But at last a lucky turn gave him a clearer view. He hastily arrested his hand and brought his intelligence to bear. Mercurius, in fact, had climbed up again, just as the Frau Director said. The column was perceptibly lengthened. It stood several of the black strokes above normal. Hans Castorp had 99.6 degrees. 99 and 6/10 degrees in broad daylight, between 10 and 1/2 in the morning. That was too much. It was temperature. It was fever consequent on an infection, for which his system had been eager. The question was now, what kind of infection? 99.6 degrees. Why, Joachim had no more, nor anyone else up here, except the moribund and bedridden. Not Fräulein Kleefeld with her pneumothorax, nor Madame Chowchat. Naturally, in his case it was not the same kind, certainly not. He had what would have been called at home a feverish cold. But the distinction was not such a simple one to make. Hans Castorp doubted whether the fever had only come on when the cold did, and he regretted not having consulted a thermometer at the outset, when the Hofrat suggested it. He could see now that this had been very reasonable advice. Settembrini had been wrong to sneer at it as he had, Settembrini, with his Republic and his bellow style. Hans Castorp loathed and contemned the Republic and the bellow style as he stood there consulting his thermometer. He kept on losing the mark and turning the instrument this way and that to find it again. Yes, it registered 99.6 degrees, and this in the early part of the day. He was thoroughly upset. He walked the length of the room twice or thrice, the thermometer held horizontally in his hand, so as not to jiggle it and make it read differently. Then he carefully deposited it on the wash-hand stand and went with his overcoat and rugs into the balcony. Sitting down, he threw the covers about him, with practiced hand, first from one side, then from the other, and lay still, waiting until it should be time for Joachim to fetch him for second breakfast. Now and then he smiled. It was precisely as though he smiled at somebody. And now and then his breast heaved as he caught his breath and was seized with his bronchial cough. Joachim found him still lying when he entered at 11 o'clock at sound of the gong for second breakfast. "Well?" he asked in surprise, coming up to his cousin's chair. Hans Castorp sat a while without answering, looking in front of him. Then he said, "Well, the latest is that I have some fever." "What do you mean?"
Joachim asked.
"Do you feel feverish?" Again Hans Castorp let him wait a little for the answer, then delivered himself airily as follows. "Feverish, my dear fellow, I have felt for a long time. All the time I have been up here, in fact. But at the moment it is not a matter of subjective emotion, but of fact. I have taken my temperature." "You've taken your temperature? What with?" Joachim cried, startled. "With a thermometer, naturally," answered Hans Castorp, not without a caustic tinge to his voice. "Frau Director sold me one. Why she should call me young I can't imagine. It is distinctly not comme il faut. But she lost no time in selling me an excellent thermometer. If you would like to convince yourself, you can. It is there on the washhand stand. It is only slight fever." Joachim turned on his heel and went into the bedroom. When he came back, he said hesitatingly, "Yes, it is 99.51 degrees. "Then it has gone down a little," his cousin responded hastily. "It was 6. "But you can't call that slight fever," Joachim said. "Certainly not for the forenoon. This is a pretty how—" And he stood by his cousin's side as one stands before a how-do-you-do, arms akimbo and head dropped. "You'll have to go to bed." Hans Castorp had his answer ready. "I can't see," he remarked, "why I should go to bed with a temperature of 99.6 degrees when the rest of you, who haven't any less, can run about as you like." "But that is different," Joachim said. "Your fever is acute and harmless, the result of a cold." "In the first place," said Hans Castorp, speaking with dignity and dividing his remarks into categories, "I cannot comprehend why, with a harmless fever, assuming for the moment that there is such a thing, one must keep one's bed, while with one that is not harmless you needn't. And secondly, I tell you the fever has not made me hotter than I was before. My position is that 99.6 degrees is 99.6 degrees. If you can run about with it, so can I." "But I had to lie for 4 weeks when I first came," objected Joachim, "and they only let me get up when it was clear that the fever persisted even after I had lain in bed." Hans Castorp smiled. "Well, and?" he asked. "I thought it was different with you. It seems to me you are contradicting yourself. First you say our cases are different, then you say they are alike. That seems sheer twaddle to me." Joachim made a right-about turn. When he turned round again, his suntan visage showed an even darker shade. "No," he said, "I am not saying they are alike. You're getting muddled. I only mean that you've a very nasty cold. I can hear it in your voice, and you ought to go to bed, to cut it short if you mean to go home next week. But if you don't want to, I mean go to bed, why don't. I am not prescribing for you. Anyhow, let's go to breakfast. Make haste, we are late already." "Right-o," said Hans Castorp, and flung off his covers. He went into his room to run the brush over his hair, and Joachim looked again at the thermometer on the washhand stand. Hans Castorp watched him. They went down, silently, and took their places in the dining room, which, as always at this hour, shimmered white with milk. The dwarf waitress brought Hans Castorp his Kulmbacher beer, as usual, but he put on a long face and waved it away. He would drink no beer today. He would drink nothing at all, or, at most, a swallow of water. The attention of his table-mates was attracted. They wanted to know the cause of his caprice. Hans Castorp said carelessly that he had a little fever, really minimal, 99.6 degrees. Then how altogether ludicrous it was to see them. They shook their fingers at him. They winked maliciously. They put their heads on one side, crooked their forefingers beside their ears, and waggled them in a pantomime suggestive of their delight at having found him out, who had played the innocent so long. "Uh-huh," said the schoolmistress, the flush mounting in her ancient cheek. "What sort of scandal is this?" And "aha," went Frau Store too, holding her stumpy finger next her stumpy nose. "So our respected guest has some temperament too. Foxy Loxy is in the same boat with the rest of us after all. Even the great aunt, When the news traveled up to her end of the table, gave him a meaningful glance and smile. Pretty Marusha, who had barely looked at him up to now, leaned over and stared, with her round brown eyes, her handkerchief to her lips, and shook her finger too. Frau Storr whispered the news to Dr. Blumenkohl, who could hardly do otherwise than join in the game, though without looking at Hans Castorp. Only Miss Robinson sat as she always did, and took no share in what was going on. Joachim kept his eyes on the tablecloth. It flattered Hans Castorp's vanity to be taken so much notice of, but he felt that modesty required him to disclaim their attentions. "No, no," he said. "You are all mistaken. My fever is the most harmless thing in the world. I simply have a cold, my eyes run, and my chest is stopped up. I have coughed half the night. It is thoroughly unpleasant, of course." But they would not listen. They laughed and flapped their hands at him. "Yes, of course, we know all about it. We know these colds. They are all gammon. You can't fool us." And with one accord they challenged Hans Castorp to an examination on the spot. The news excited them. Throughout the meal their table was the liveliest among the seven. Frau Storr became almost hysterical. Her peevish face looked scarlet above her neck ruche, and tiny purple veins showed in the cheeks. She began to talk about how fascinating it was to cough. It was a solid satisfaction when you felt a tickling come in your chest, deep down and grow, to reach down after it and get at it, so to say. Sneezing was much the same thing. You kept on wanting to sneeze until you simply couldn't stand it any longer. You looked as if you were tipsy. You drew a couple of breaths. Then out it came, and you forgot everything else in the bliss of the sensation. Sometimes the explosion repeated itself 2 or 3 times. That was the sort of pleasure life gave you free of charge. Another one was the joy of scratching your chilblains in the spring, when they itched so gorgeously. You took a furious pleasure in scratching till the blood came, and if you happened to look in the glass you would be astonished to see the ghastly face you made. The coarse creature regaled the table with these repulsive details throughout the brief, but hearty meal. When it was over, the cousins walked down to the Platz. Joachim seemed preoccupied. Hans Castorp was in an agony of snuffles and cleared his rasping throat continually. On the way home Joachim said, "I'll make you a suggestion. Tomorrow, after midday meal, I have my regular monthly examination. It is not the general. Behrens just auscultates a little and has Krokowski make some notes. You might come along and ask them to listen to you a bit. It is too absurd. If you were at home, you would send for Heidekind, and up here with 2 specialists in the house, you run about and don't know where you are, nor how serious it is, and if it would not be better for you to go to bed." "Very good," said Hans Castorp. "It's as you say, of course. I can do that. And it will be interesting to see an examination." Thus it was settled between them, and it fell out that as they arrived before the sanatorium, they met the Hofrat himself, and took the occasion to put their request at once. Behrens came out of the vestibule, tall and stooped, a bowler hat on the back of his head, a cigar in his mouth, purple-cheeked, watery-eyed, in the full flow of his professional activities. He had just come from the operating room, so he said, and was on his way to private practice in the village. "Morning, gentlemen, morning," he said. "Always on the jump, eh? How's everything in the big world? I've just come from an unequal duel with saw and scalpel, great thing, resection of ribs. 50% of the cases used to be left on the table. Nowadays we have it down finer than that, but even so it's a good plan to get the mortis causa fixed up beforehand. The chap today knew how to take the joke, put up a good fight for a minute or so. Crazy thing, a human thorax that's all gone, pulpy, nothing to catch hold of, slight confusion of ideas, so to speak. Well, and how are your constitutionalities? Sanctified metabolisms functioning okay, doing their duty in the sight of the Lord? The walks go better in company. Ziemson, old fellow, what? Hello, what are you crying about, Mr. Tripper?" He suddenly turned on Hans Castorp. "It's against the rules to cry in public. They might all start." "It's only my cold, a Hofrat," answered Hans Castorp. "I don't know how I did it, but I've a simply priceless catarrh. It's right down on my chest, and I cough a good deal too." "Indeed," Behrens remarked. "You ought to consult a reliable physician." Both cousins laughed, and Joachim answered, heels together, "We were just going to, Herr Hofrat." I have my examination tomorrow, and we wanted to ask if you would be so kind as to look my cousin over as well. The question is whether he'll be well enough to travel on Tuesday." "AYS," said Behrens. "At your service. With all the pleasure in life. Ought to have done it long ago. Once you are up here, why not? But one doesn't like to seem forth-putting. Very good then, tomorrow at 2, directly after grub. I have a little fever too," Hans Castorp further observed. "You don't say." Behrens cried out. "I suppose you think you are telling me news? Do you think I've no eyes in my head?" He pointed with his great index finger to his goggling, bloodshot, watery eyes. "Well, and how much?" Hans Castorp modestly mentioned the figure. "Forenoon, eh? That's not so bad. Not bad at all for a beginner shows talent. Very good then, the two of you, tomorrow at 2. Very much honored. Well, so long, enjoy yourselves." He paddled away downhill, his knees bent, leaving a long streamer of cigar smoke behind him. "Well, that came out just as you wanted it to," Hans Castorp said. "We couldn't have struck it luckier, and now I am in for it. He won't be able to do much, of course. He may prescribe some sort of pectoral syrup or some cough lozenges. However, it is good to have a little encouragement when you feel the way I do. But for heaven's sake, what makes him rattle on so? It struck me as funny at first, but in the long run, I can't say I like it. Sanctified metabolism. What sort of gibberish is that? If I understand what he means by metabolism, it is nothing but physiology, and to talk about its being sanctified, irreverent, I call it. I don't enjoy seeing him smoke, either. It distresses me, because I know it is not good for him and gives him melancholia. Settembrini said his joviality is forced, and one must admit that Settembrini has his own views and knows whereof he speaks. I probably ought to have more opinions of my own, as he says, and not take everything as it comes, the way I do. But sometimes one starts out with having an opinion and feeling righteous indignation and all that, and then something comes up that has nothing to do with judgments and criticism, and then it is all up with your severity, and you feel disgusted with the Republic and the bellow style. He rambled on incoherently, not clear himself as to what he wanted to say. His cousin merely gave him a side glance, then turned away with an au revoir, and each betook him to his own balcony. "How much?" asked Joachim softly after a while, as though he had seen Hans Castorp consult his thermometer. And the latter answered indifferently, "Nothing new." He had, in fact, directly he entered, taken up his new acquisition from the wash-hand stand and plunged it repeatedly through the air to obliterate the morning's record. Then he went into the balcony with a glass cigar in his mouth, like an old hand. But contrary to some rather exaggerated expectations, Mercurius climbed no further than before, though Hans Castorp kept the instrument under his tongue 8 minutes for good measure. But after all, 99.6 degrees was unquestionably fever, even though no higher than the earlier record. In the afternoon, the gleaming column mounted up as far as 99.7 degrees, but declined to 99.5 degrees by evening when the patient was weary with the excitement of the day. Next morning it showed 99.6 degrees, climbing during the morning to the same level as before. And so arrived the hour for the main meal of the day, bringing the examination in its wake. Hans Castorp later recalled that Madame Chowchat was wearing that day a golden yellow sweater with large buttons and embroidered pockets. It was a new sweater, at least new to Hans Castorp, and when she made her entrance, tardily as usual, she had paused an instant and, in the way he knew so well, presented herself to the room. Then she had glided to her place at the table, slipped softly into it, and begun to eat and chatter to her table-mates. All this was as it happened every day, 5 times a day. Hans Castorp observed it as usual, or perhaps even more poignantly than usual, looking over at the good, Russian table past Settembrini's back, as he sat at the crosswise table between. He saw the turn of her head in conversation, the rounded neck, the stooping back. Frau Chowchat, for her part, never once turned round during the whole meal. But when the sweet had been handed, and the great clock on the wall above the bad Russian table struck 2, it actually happened, to Hans Castorp's amazement and mystification, that precisely as the hour struck 1, 2, the fair patient turned her head, and a little twisted her body and looked over her shoulder quite openly and pointedly at Hans Castorp's table. And not only at his table. No, she looked at himself, unmistakably and personally, with a smile about the closed lips and the narrow, Pribislav eyes, as though to say, "Well, it is time. Are you going?" And the eyes said, "Thou," for that is the language of the eyes, even when the tongue uses a more formal address. This episode shook and bewildered Hans Castorp to the depths of his being. He hardly trusted his senses, and at first gazed enraptured in Frau Chauchat's face, then, lifting his eyes, stared into vacancy over the top of her head. Was it possible she knew he was to be examined at 2 o'clock? It looked like it, but that was as impossible as that she should be aware of the thought that had visited his mind in the last minute, namely, that he might as well send word to the Hofrat, through Joachim, that his cold was better, and he considered an examination superfluous. This idea had presented itself to him in an advantageous light, but now withered away under that searching smile, transmuted into a hideous sense of futility. The second after, Joachim had laid his rolled-up serviette beside his plate, signaled to his cousin by raising his eyebrows, and with a bow to the company risen from the table. Whereat Hans Castorp, inwardly reeling, though outwardly firm in step and bearing, rose too, and feeling that look and smile upon his back, followed cousin Joachim out of the room. Since the previous morning they had not spoken of what lay before them, and silently now they moved down the corridor together. Joachim hastened his steps, for it was already past the appointed hour, and Hofrat Behrens laid stress on punctuality. They passed the door of the office and went down the clean linoleum-covered stairs to the basement. Joachim knocked at the door facing them. It bore a porcelain shield with the word consulting room. "Come in," called Behrens, stressing the first word. He was standing in the middle of the room, in his white smock, holding the black stethoscope in his hand and tapping his thigh with it. "Tempo, tempo," said he, directing his goggling gaze to the clock on the wall. "Un poco più presto, signori. We are not here simply and solely for the honorable gentleman's convenience." Dr. Krokowski was sitting at the double-barreled writing table by the window. He wore his usual black alpaca shirt, setting off the pallor of his face. His elbows rested on the table, in one hand a pen, the other fingering his beard, while before him lay various papers, probably the documents in reference to the patients to be examined. He looked at the cousins as they entered, but it was with the idle glance of a person who is present only in an auxiliary capacity. "Well, give us your report card." The Hofrat answered to Joachim's apologies and took the fever chart out of his hand. He looked it over, while the patient made haste to lay off his upper garments down to the waist and hang them on the rack by the door. No one troubled about Hans Castorp. He looked on a while standing, then let himself down in a little old-fashioned easy chair with bob tassels on the arms, beside a small table with a carafe on it. Bookcases lined the walls, full of pamphlets and broad-backed medical works. Other furniture there was none, except an adjustable chaise longue covered with oilcloth. It had a paper serviette spread over the pillow. ".7, .9, .8, Behrens said, running through the weekly card, whereon were entered the results of Joachim's 5 daily measurings. "Still a little too much lighted up, my dear Ziemsen. Can't exactly say you've got more robust just lately." By the lately, he meant during the past 4 weeks. "Not free from infection," he said. "Well, that doesn't happen between one day and the next. We're not magicians." Joachim nodded and shrugged his bare shoulders. He refrained from saying that he had been up here since a good deal longer than yesterday. How about the stitches in the right hilum, where it always sounded so sharp? Better? Well, come along, let me thump you about a bit. And the auscultation began. The Hofrat stood leaning backwards, feet wide apart, his stethoscope under his arm, and tapped from the wrist, using the powerful middle finger of his right hand as a hammer and the left as a support. He tapped first high up on Joachim's shoulder blade at the side of the back, above and below, the well-trained Joachim lifting his arm to let himself be tapped under the armpit. Then the process was repeated on the left side. Then the Hofrat commanded, "Turn," and began tapping the chest, first next the collarbone, then above and below the breast, right and left. When he had tapped to his satisfaction, he began to listen, setting his stethoscope on Joachim's chest and back and putting his ear to the earpiece. Then Joachim had to breathe deeply and cough, which seemed to strain him, for he got out of breath, and tears came in his eyes. And everything that the Hofrat heard, he announced in curt, technical phrases to his assistant over at the writing table, in such a way that Hans Castorp was forcibly reminded of the proceedings at the tailor's when a very correctly groomed gentleman measures you for a suit, laying the tape about your trunk and limbs and calling off the figures in the order hallowed by tradition for the assistant to take them down in his book. Faint, diminished, dictated Hofrat Behrens. Vesicular, and then again vesicular, that was good, apparently. Rough, he said, and made a face. Very rough. Ronke. And Dr. Krokowski entered it all in his book, just like the tailor's assistant. Hans Castorp followed the proceedings with his head on one side, absorbed in contemplation of his cousin's torso. The ribs, thank heaven, he had them all, rose under the taut skin as he took deep inhalations, and the stomach fell away. Hans Castorp studied that youthful figure, slender, yellowish bronze, with a black fell along the breastbone and the powerful arms. On one wrist, Joachim wore a gold chain bracelet. Those are the arms of an athlete, thought Hans Castorp. I never made much of gymnastics, but he always liked them, and that is partly the reason why he wanted to be a soldier. He has always been more inclined than I to the things of the body, or inclined in a different way. I've always been a civilian and cared more about warm baths and good eating and drinking, whereas he has gone in for manly exertion. And now his body has come into the foreground in another sense and made itself important and independent of the rest of him, namely, through illness. He is all lit up within and can't get rid of the infection and become healthy, poor Joachim, no matter how much he wants to get down to the valley and be a soldier. And yet look how he is developed, like a picture in a book, a regular Apollo Belvedere, except for the hair. But the disease makes him ailing within and fevered without. Disease makes men more physical. It leaves them nothing but body. His own thought startled him, and he looked quickly at Joachim with a questioning glance that traveled from the bared body up to the large, gentle black eyes. Tears stood out in them, from the effort of the forced breathing and coughing, and they gazed into space with a pathetic expression as the examination went on. But at last Hofrat Behrens had come to an end. Very good, Ziemsen, he said. Everything in order, so far as possible. Next time, that would be in 4 weeks, it is bound to show further improvement. And Herr Hofrat, how much longer do you think? So, you are going to pester me again? How do you expect to give your lads the devil down below, in the lit-up state you are in? I told you the other day to call it half a year. You can reckon from then if you like, but you must regard it as minimal. Have a little ordinary politeness. It's a decent enough life up here, after all. It's not a convict prison, nor a Siberian penal settlement. Or perhaps you think it is. Very good, Ziemsen. Be off with you. Next. Step lively. He stretched out his arm and handed the stethoscope to Dr. Krokowski, who got up and began some supernumerary tapping on Joachim's person. Hans Castorp had sprung up, with his eyes fixed on the Hofrat, standing there with his legs apart and his mouth open, lost in thought. The young man began in all haste to make ready, with the result that he defeated his own purpose and fumbled in getting out of his shirt. But finally he stood there, blond, white-skinned, and narrow-chested, before Hofrat Behrens. Compared with Joachim, he looked distinctly the civilian type. The Hofrat, still lost in thought, let him stand. Dr. Krokowski had finished and sat down, and Joachim was dressing before Behrens finally decided to take notice. "Oh ho," he said. "So that's you, is it?" He gripped Hans Castorp on the upper arm with his mighty hand, pushed him away, and looked at him sharply, not in the face, as one man looks at another, but at his body, turned him round, as one would turn an inanimate object, and looked at his back. He said. "Well, we shall see," and began tapping as before. He tapped all over as he had with Joachim, and several times went back and tapped again. For some while, for purposes of comparison, he tapped by turns on the left-hand side, near the collarbone, and then somewhat lower down. "Hear that?" he asked Dr. Krokowski. And the other, sitting at the table 5 paces off, nodded to signify that he did. He sunk his head on his chest with a serious mien, and the points of his whiskers stuck out. "Breathe deep. Cough," commanded the Hofrat, who had taken up the stethoscope again, and Hans Castorp worked hard for 8 or 10 minutes, while the Hofrat listened. He uttered no word, simply set the instrument here or there, and listened with particular care at the places he had tapped so long. Then he stuck the stethoscope under his arm, put his hands on his back, and looked at the floor between himself and Hans Castorp. "Yes, Castorp," he said. This was the first time he had called the young man simply by his last name. "The thing works out preta propta, as I thought it would. I had my suspicions. I can tell you now, from the first day I had the undeserved honor of making your acquaintance. I made a pretty shrewd guess that you were one of us, and that you would find it out, like many another who has come up here on a lark and gone about with his nose in the air, only to discover, one fine day, that it would be as well for him, and not only as well, mark that, to make a more extended stay, quite without reference to the beauties of the scenery." Hans Castorp had flushed. Joachim, in act to button his braces, paused as he stood and listened. "You have such a kind, sympathetic cousin over there," went on the Hofrat, motioning with his head in Joachim's direction and balancing himself on his heels. "Very soon, we hope, we will be able to say that he has been ill, but even when he gets that far, it will still be true that he has been ill, and the fact, a priori, as the philosophers say, casts a certain light upon yourself, my dear Castorp. But he is only my step-cousin, Hofrat."
"Tut.
"You won't disown him, will you? Even a step-cousin is a blood relation." "On which side?" "The mother's, Hofrat. He is the son of a step." "And your mother, she's pretty jolly?"
"No, she is dead."
"She died when I was little." "And of what?" "Of a blood clot, Hofrat." "A blood clot, eh? Well, that's a long time ago." "And your father?" "He died of pneumonia," Hans Castorp said. "And my grandfather too," he added.
"Both of them, eh? Good."
"So much for your ancestors. Now about yourself. You have always been rather chlorotic, haven't you? But you didn't tire easily at physical or mental work. Or did you, what? A good deal of palpitation? Only of late?"
"Good."
"And a strong inclination to catarrhal and bronchial trouble. Did you know you have been infected before now?"
"Yes,
you. I have you personally in mind. Can you hear any difference?" The Hofrat tapped by turns on Hans Castorp's left side, first above and then lower down. "It sounds rather duller there," said Hans Castorp. "Capital. You ought to be a specialist." "Well, that is a dullness, and such dullnesses are caused by the old places where fibrosis has supervened. Scars, you know. You are an old patient, Castorp, but we won't lay it up against anybody that you weren't found out. The early diagnosis is very difficult, particularly for my colleagues down below. I won't say we have better ears, though the regular practice does do something. But the air helps us here, if you understand what I mean, this thin, dry air up here." "Certainly, of course," Hans Castorp said. "Very good, Castorp. And now listen, young man, to my words of wisdom. If that were all the trouble with you, if it was a case of nothing but the dullness and the scars on your bagpipe in there, I should send you back to your Laras and Penates and not trouble my head further about you. But as things stand, and according to what we find, and since you are already up here, well, there is no use in your going down, for you'd only have to come up again." Hans Castorp felt the blood rush back to his heart. It hammered violently, and Joachim still stood with his hands on his back buttons, his eyes on the floor. "For besides the dullness," said the Hofrat, "you have on the upper left side a rough breathing that is almost bronchial and undoubtedly comes from a fresh place. I won't call it a focus of softening, but it is certainly a moist spot, and if you go down below and begin to carry on, why, you'll have the whole lobe at the devil before you can say Jack Robinson." Hans Castorp stood motionless. His mouth twitched fearfully, and the hammering of his heart against his ribs was plain to see. He looked across at Joachim, but could not meet his cousin's eye, then again in the Hofrat's face, with its blue cheeks, blue, goggling eyes, and little, crooked mustache. "For independent confirmation," Behrens continued, We have your temperature of 99.6 degrees at 10 o'clock in the morning, which corresponds pretty well to the indications given by the auscultation. I thought, Hans Castorp said, that the fever came from my cold. And the cold, rejoined the Hofrat. Where does that come from? Listen, Castorp, let me tell you something, and mark my words, for so far as I can tell, you've all the cerebral convolutions a body needs. Now, our air up here is good for the disease, good against the disease, you understand. You think so, don't you? Well, it is true. But also it is good for the disease. It begins by speeding it up, in that it revolutionizes the whole body. It brings the latent weakness to the surface and makes it break out. Your catarrh, fortunately for you, is a breaking out of that kind. I can't tell if you were febrile down below, but it is certainly my opinion that you have been from your first day up here, and not merely since you had your catarrh. Yes, Hans Castorp said. I think so too. You were probably fuddled right from the start in my opinion, the Hofrat confirmed him. Those were the soluble toxins thrown off by the bacteria. They act like an intoxicant upon the central nervous system and give you a hectic flush. Now, Castorp, we'll stick you into bed and see if a couple of weeks' rest will sober you up. What follows will follow. We'll take a handsome X-ray of you. You'll enjoy seeing what goes on in your own inside. But I tell you straight away, a case like yours doesn't get well from one day to the next. It isn't a question of the miracle cures you read about in advertisements. I thought when I first clapped eyes on you that you would be a better patient than your cousin, with more talent for illness than our Brigadier General here, who wants to clear out directly. He has a couple of points less fever. As if lie down isn't just as good a word of command as stand up. It is the citizen's first duty to be calm, and impatience never did any good to anyone. Now, Castorp, watch out you don't disappoint me, and give the lie to my knowledge of human nature. Get along now. Into the caboose with you, march. With that, Hofrat Behrens closed the interview and sat down at the writing table. This man of many occupations began to fill in his time with writing until the advent of the next patient. But Dr. Krokowski arose from his place and strode up to Hans Castorp. With his head tipped back sideways and one hand on the young man's shoulder, smiling so heartily that the yellowish teeth showed in his beard, he shook him warmly by the hand. Soup everlasting. And now we are confronted by a phenomenon upon which the author himself may well comment, lest the reader do so in his stead. Our account of the first 3 weeks of Hans Castorp's stay with those up here, 21 midsummer days, to which his visit, so far as human eye could see, should have been confined, has consumed in the telling an amount of time and space only too well confirming the author's half-confessed expectations, while our narrative of his next 3 weeks will scarcely cost as many lines, or even words and minutes, as the earlier 3 did pages, quires, hours, and working days. We apprehend that these next 3 weeks will be over and done with in the twinkling of an eye, which is perhaps surprising, yet quite in order and conformable to the laws that govern the telling of stories and the listening to them. For it is in accordance with these laws that time seems to us just as long, or just as short, that it expands or contracts precisely in the way, and to the extent, that it did for young Hans Castorp, our hero, whom our narrative now finds visited with such an unexpected blow from the hand of fate. It may even be well at this point to prepare the reader for still other surprises, still other phenomena, bearing on the mysterious element of time, which will confront us if we continue in our hero's company. For the moment we need only recall the swift flight of time, even of a quite considerable period of time, which we spend in bed when we are ill. All the days are nothing but the same day repeating itself, or rather, since it is always the same day, it is incorrect to speak of repetition, a continuous present, an identity, an everlastingness. Such words as these would better convey the idea. They bring you your midday broth, as they brought it yesterday and will bring it tomorrow, and it comes over you. But whence or how you do not know, it makes you quite giddy to see the broth coming in, that you are losing a sense of the demarcation of time, that its units are running together, disappearing, and what is being revealed to you as the true content of time is merely a dimensionless present in which they eternally bring you the broth. But in such a connection it would be paradoxical to speak of time as passing slowly, and paradox, with reference to such a hero, we would avoid. Hans Castorp, then, went to bed on the Saturday afternoon, as it had been ordained by Hofrat Barons, the highest authority in our little world. There he lay, in his nightshirt with the embroidered monogram on the pocket, his hands clasped at the back of his head, in his cleanly white bed, the deathbed of the American woman and in all probability of many another person, lay there with his confiding blue eyes, somewhat glassy with his cold, directed toward the ceiling, and contemplated the singularity of his fate. This is not to say that, if he had not had a cold, his gaze would have been any clearer or more single-minded. No, just as it was, it accurately mirrored his inner state, and that, whatever its simplicity, was full of troubled, involved, dubious, not quite ingenuous thoughts. For as he lay, he would be shaken from deep within him by a frantic burst of triumphant laughter, while his heart stood still with an anguish of extravagant anticipation like nothing he had ever known before. Again, he would feel such a shudder of apprehension as sent the color from his cheek, and then it was conscience itself that knocked, in the very throbs of his heart as it pulsed against his ribs. On that first day Joachim left him to his rest, avoiding all discussion. He went 2 or 3 times tactfully into the sick room, nodded to the patient, and inquired if he could do anything. It was easy for him to understand and respect Hans Castorp's reserve, the more in that he shared it, even feeling his own position to be more difficult than the others. But on Sunday forenoon, when he came back from the walk which for the first time in weeks had been solitary, there was no putting it off any longer. They must take counsel together over the necessary next step. He sat down by the bed and said with a sigh, "Yes, it's no good. We must act. They are expecting you down home." "Not yet," Hans Castorp answered. "No, but inside the next few days, Wednesday or Thursday." "Oh, they aren't expecting me so precisely on a particular day," Hans Castorp said. "They have other things to do besides counting the days until I get back. I'll be there when I get there, and Uncle Tienapel will say, 'Oh, there you are again, and Uncle James. Well, had a good time?' And if I don't arrive, it will be some time before they notice it, you may be sure of that. Of course, after a while we'd have to let them know." "You can see how unpleasant the thing is for me," Joachim said, sighing again. "What is to happen now? I feel in a way responsible. You come up here to pay me a visit, I take you in, and here you are, and who knows when you can get away and go into your position down below. You must see how extremely painful that is to me." "Just a moment," said Hans Castorp, without removing his hands from their clasped position behind his neck. "Surely it is unreasonable for you to break your head over it. Did I come up here to visit you? Well, of course in a way I did, but after all, the principal reason was to get the rest Heidkind prescribed. Well, and now it appears I need more of a rest than he or any of us dreamed. I am not the first who thought of making a flying visit up here for whom it fell out differently. Remember about Tules Dua's second son, and how it turned out with him? I don't know whether he is still alive or not. Perhaps they have fetched him away already, while we were sitting at our meal. That I am somewhat infected is naturally a great surprise to me. I must get used to the idea of being a patient and one of you, instead of just a guest. And yet in a way I am scarcely surprised, for I never have been in such blooming health, and when I think how young both my parents were when they died, I realize that it was natural I shouldn't be particularly robust. We can't deny that you had a weakness that way. We make no bones of it, even if it is as good as cured now, and it may easily be that it runs a little in the family, as Baron suggested. Anyhow, I have been lying here since yesterday thinking it all over, considering what my attitude has been, how I felt toward the whole thing to life, you know, and the demands it makes on you. A certain seriousness, a sort of disinclination to rough and noisy ways, has always been a part of my nature. We were talking about that lately, and I said I sometimes should have liked to be a clergyman because I took such an interest in mournful and edifying things, a black pall, you know, with a silver cross on it, or R.I.P. Requiescat in pace, you know. That seems to me the most beautiful expression. I like it much better than he's a jolly good fellow, which is simply rowdy. I think all that comes from the fact that I have a weakness myself, and always felt at home with illness, the way I do now. But things being as they are, I find it very lucky that I came here and that I was examined. Certainly you have no call to reproach yourself. You heard what he said. If I were to go down and continue as I have been, I should have the whole lobe at the devil before I could say Jack Robinson. You can't tell, Joachim said. That is just what you never can tell. They said you had already hid places, of which nobody took any notice, and they healed of themselves, and left nothing but a few trifling dullnesses. It might have been the same way with the moist spot you are supposed to have now, if you hadn't come up here at all. One can never know. No, as far as knowing goes, we never can. But just for that reason, we have no right to assume the worst, for instance with regard to how long I shall be obliged to stop here. You say nobody knows when I shall be free to go into the shipyard, but you say it in a pessimistic sense, and that I find premature, since we cannot know. Behrens did not set a limit. He is a long-headed man, and doesn't play the prophet. There are the X-ray and the photographic plate yet to come before we can definitely know the facts. Who knows whether they will show anything worth talking about, and whether I shall not be free of fever before that, and can say goodbye to you. I am all for our not striking before the time, and crying wolf to the family down below. It is quite enough for the present if we write and say, I can do it myself with the fountain pen if I sit up a little, that I have a severe cold and am febrile, that I am stopping in bed, and shall not travel for the present. The rest will follow. Good, said Joachim. We can do that, for the present. And for the other matters we can wait and see. What other matters? Don't be so irresponsible. You only came for 3 weeks and brought a steamer trunk. You will need underwear and linen and winter clothes and more footwear. And anyhow you will want money sent. If, said Hans Castorp, if I need it. Very well, we'll wait and see. But we ought not. Joachim paced up and down the room as he spoke. We ought not to behave like ostriches. I have been up here too long not to know how things go. When Behrens says there is a rough place, almost ronky, oh well, of course, we can wait and see. There, for the time, the matter rested, and the weekly and fortnightly variations of the normal day set in. Hans Castorp could partake of them even in his present state, if not at first hand, then through the reports Joachim gave, when he came and sat by the bedside for 15 minutes. His Sunday morning breakfast tray was adorned with a vase of flowers, and they did not fail to send him his share of the Sunday pastries. After luncheon the sounds of social intercourse floated up from the terrace below, and with tantara and squealing of clarinets the fortnightly concert began. During its progress Joachim entered, and sat down by the open balcony door, his cousin half reclined in his bed, with his head on one side, and his eyes swimming with pious enjoyment as he listened to the mounting harmonies, and bestowed a momentary metaphorical shoulder shrug upon Settembrini's twaddle about music being politically suspect. And, as we have said, he had Joachim post him upon the sights and events of the sanatorium life. Had there, he asked, been any toilets made in honor of the day, lace matinees or that sort of thing? Though for lace matinees the weather was too cold. Whether there were people going driving, certain expeditions had in fact been undertaken, among others by the Half-Lung Club, which had gone in a body to Clavedel. On the next day, Monday, he demanded to hear all about Dr. Krokowski's lecture, when Joachim came from it and looked in upon his cousin on his way to the rest cure. Joachim did not feel like talking. He appeared disinclined to make a report. He would have let the subject drop, as it had after the previous lecture, had not Hans Castorp persisted and demanded to hear details. I am lying up here, he said, paying full pension. I am entitled to have all that is going. He recalled the Monday of 2 weeks ago and his solitary walk, which had done him so little good, and committed himself to the view that it was that walk which had revolutionized his system and brought to the surface the latent infection. But what a stately and solemn way the people hereabout have of talking, he said. I mean the common people, almost like poetry. Then thank ye kindly, and God be with ye, he repeated, giving the words the woodman's intonation. I heard that up in the woods, and I shall remember it all my life. You get to associate a thing like that with other memories and impressions, you know, and you never forget it as long as you lived. Well, so Krokowski held forth again on the subject of love. Did he? What did he say about it today? Oh, nothing in particular. You know from the other time how he talks. But what did he offer that was new? Nothing different. Oh, well, the stuff today was pure chemistry. Joachim unwillingly condescended to enlighten his cousin. It seemed there was a sort of poisoning, an auto-infection of the organisms, so Dr. Krokowski said. It was caused by the disintegration of a substance, of the nature of which we were still ignorant, but which was present everywhere in the body, and the products of this disintegration operated like an intoxicant upon the nerve centers of the spinal cord, with an effect similar to that of certain poisons, such as morphia or cocaine, when introduced in the usual way from outside. "And so you get the hectic flush," said Hans Castorp. "But that's all worth hearing. What doesn't the man know? He must have simply lapped it up. You just wait. One of these days he will discover what that substance is that exists everywhere in the body and sets free the soluble toxins that act like a narcotic on the nervous system. Then he will be able to fuddle us all more than ever. Perhaps in the past they were able to do that very thing. When I listened to him, I could almost think there is some truth in the old legends about love potions and the like. Are you going?" "Yes," Joachim said. "I must go lie down. My curve has been rising since yesterday. This affair of yours has had its effect on me." That was the Sunday and the Monday. The evening and the morning made the third day of Hans Castorp's sojourn in the caboose. It was a day without distinction, an ordinary weekday, that Tuesday, but after all, it was the day of his arrival in this place. He had been here around 3 weeks, and time pressed. He would have to send a letter home and inform his uncle of the state of affairs, even though cursorily and without reference to their true inwardness. He stuffed his down quilt behind his back and wrote upon the notepaper of the establishment, to the effect that his departure was being delayed beyond the appointed time. He was in bed with a feverish cold, which Hofrat Behrens, overconscientious as he probably was, refused to take lightly, insisting on regarding it as immediately connected with his, Hans Castorp's, constitution and general state of health. The physician had perceived directly he saw him that he was decidedly anemic, and take it all in all, it seemed as though the limit he had originally set for his stay was not regarded by the authorities as long enough for a full recovery. He would write again as soon as he could. That's the idea, thought Hans Castorp, not too much or too little, and whatever the issue, it will satisfy them for a while. The letter was given to the servant, with instructions that it be taken direct to the station and sent off by the earliest possible train, instead of being posted in the usual way in the house letterbox, with consequent delays. Our adventurous youth felt much relieved to have set affairs in such good train, if likewise a good deal plagued by his cough and the heavy-headedness caused by his catarrh, and now he began to live each day as it came, a day which never varied, which was always broken up into a number of sections, and which, in its abiding uniformity, could not be said either to pass too fast or to hang too heavy on the hands. In the morning the bathing master would give a mighty thump on the door and enter, a nervous individual named Turnher, who wore his sleeves rolled up, and had great standing veins upon his forearms and a gurgling, impeded speech. He addressed Hans Castorp, as he did all the patients, by the number of his room, and rubbed him with alcohol. Not long after he left, Joachim would appear ready dressed, to greet his cousin, inquire after his 7 o'clock temperature, and communicate his own. While he breakfasted below, Hans Castorp did the same above, his down quilt tucked behind his back, in enjoyment of the good appetite a change engenders. He was scarcely disturbed by the bustling and businesslike entrance of the 2 physicians, who at this hour made a hurried round of the dining hall and the rooms of the bedridden and moribund. Hans Castorp, with his mouth full of jam, announced himself to have slept splendidly and looked over the rim of his cup at the Hofrat, who leaned with his fists on the center table and hastily scanned the fever chart. Both physicians wished him good morning, and he responded in an unconcerned drawl as they went out. Then he lighted a cigarette and beheld Joachim returning from the morning walk, almost before he realized his departure. Again they chatted of this and that. Joachim went to lie down until second breakfast, and the intervals seemed so short that even the emptiest-headed could hardly have felt bored. Hans Castorp, indeed, had so much food for thought in the events of the past 3 weeks, so much to ponder in his present state and what might come of it, that although 2 bound volumes of an illustrated periodical from the Berghof library lay upon his night table, he had no need to resort to them. It was no different with the brief hour during which Joachim took his regular walk down to the Platz. He came into Hans Castorp afterwards, told him whatever of interest he had seen, and sat or stood a few minutes by the sickbed before he withdrew to his own balcony for the midday rest. And how long did that last? Again, only a brief hour. It seemed to Hans Castorp he had barely settled to commune a little with his own thoughts, hands folded behind his head and eyes directed upon the ceiling, before the gong droned through the house, summoning all those not bedridden or moribund to prepare for the principal meal of the day. Joachim went down, and the midday broth was brought. Broth in a symbolic sense merely, considering in what it consisted. Hans Castorp was not on sick diet. He lay there and paid full pension, and what they brought him in the abiding present of that midday hour was by no means broth. It was the full 6-course Berghof dinner, in all its amplitude, with nothing left out. Even on weekdays this was a sumptuous meal. On Sundays it was a gala banquet and gaudy, prepared by a cosmopolitan chef in the kitchens of the establishment, which were precisely those of a European hotel de luxe. The dining-room girl, whose duty it was to serve the bedridden, brought it to him in dainty cookpots under nickel-plated dish covers. She produced an invalid table, a marvel of one-legged equilibrium, adjusted it across his bed, and Hans Castorp banqueted like the tailor's son in the fairy story. As he finished, Joachim would return, and it might be as late as 2:30 before the latter went into his loggia, and the hush of the main rest period fell upon the Berghof. Not quite, perhaps. Perhaps it would be nearer the truth to call it a quarter after. But these odd quarter hours outside the round figures do not count. They are swallowed up unregarded, in places where one reckons time in large units, on long train journeys of many hours on end, or wherever one is in a state of vacant suspense, with all one's being concentrated on putting the time behind one. 2:15 will pass for 2:30, will even pass for 3, on the theory that it is already well on the way toward it. The 30 minutes are taken as a sort of onset to the full hour from 3 to 4, and inwardly discounted. In this wise the duration of the main rest period was finally reduced to no more than an hour, and even this hour was lopped off at its latter end, elided, as it were. Dr. Krokowski played the part of apostrophe. Yes, nowadays when Dr. Krokowski went his independent afternoon round, he no longer made a circle round Hans Castorp. Our young man was no longer an interval and hiatus. He counted as much as the others. He too was a patient. He was questioned, not ignored, as had so long been the case, to his slight and concealed but daily recurring annoyance. It was on Monday that Dr. Krokowski for the first time manifested himself in the room. Manifested being the only proper word for the phenomenon, as Hans Castorp, with an involuntary start, perceived it. He lay in half, or quarter, slumber, and became aware that the assistant was beside him, having entered not through the door, but approaching from outside. His round at this time lay not through the corridor, but along the balconies, and he had come through the open door of the loggia with an effect of having flown through the air. There he stood at Hans Castorp's bedside, in all his pallor and blackness, broad-shouldered and squat, his lips parted in a manly smile that showed the yellowish teeth through his beard. The apostrophe. "You seem surprised to see me, Herr Castorp," he said, mildly baritone, drawling, unquestionably rather affected. He gave the R a foreign, palatal sound, not rolled, but pronounced with a single impact of the tongue against the upper front teeth. "But I am only performing my pleasant duty in seeing after your welfare. Your relations with us have entered upon a new phase. Overnight the guest has become the comrade." His patient was rather alarmed by the word comrade. "Who would have thought it?" he jested fraternally. "Who would have thought it on that evening when I had the honor of making your acquaintance, and you replied to my mistaken supposition, at that time mistaken, with the explanation that you were perfectly healthy? I believe I expressed some doubt, but I assure you I did not mean it in that sense. I will not pretend to being more sharp-sighted than I am. I was not thinking of a moist spot. My remark was meant only in the general philosophical sense, as a doubt whether the two conceptions, man and perfect health, were after all consistent one with the other. Even today, after the examination, I confess that I personally, as distinguished from my honored chief, cannot regard the moist spot as the most important factor in the situation. It is, for me, a secondary phenomenon. The organic is always secondary." Hans Castorp drew a short breath. "And thus your catarrh is, in my view, A third-line phenomenon, Dr. Krokowski concluded, very softly. How is it? The rest in bed will undoubtedly be efficacious in this respect. What have you measured today? And from then on, the assistant's visit was in the key of an ordinary professional call, to which it kept during the following days and weeks. Dr. Krokowski would enter by the open balcony door at 3:45 or earlier, greet the patient with manly readiness, put the usual professional questions, with perhaps a little personal touch as well, a jest or two, and if all this had a slight aura of the questionable about it, yet one can get used even to the questionable, provided it keeps within bounds. It was not long before Hans Castorp forgot any feeling he may have had about Dr. Krokowski's visits. They took their place in the program of the normal day, and performed, as it were, an elision in the latter end of the main rest period. The assistant would return along the balconies at 4 o'clock or thereabouts, that is to say mid-afternoon. Yes, thus suddenly, before one realized it, there one was, in the very deep of the afternoon, and steadily still deepening on toward twilight. Before tea was finished drinking, up above and down below, it was well on the way toward 5 o'clock, and by the time Joachim returned from his third daily round and looked in on his cousin, it would be near enough to 6 to reduce the remaining rest period to no more than a single hour, reckoned always in round numbers. It was an easy matter to kill that much time, if one had ideas in one's head, and a whole orbis pictus on the table to boot. Joachim, on his way to the evening meal, stopped to say goodbye. Hans Castorp's tray was brought. The valley had long since filled with shadow, and darkened apace as he ate. When he had done, he leaned back against his down quilt, with the magic table cleared before him, and looked into the growing dusk, today's dusk, yet scarcely distinguishable from the dusk of yesterday or last week. It was evening and had just been morning. The day, artificially shortened, broken into small bits, had literally crumbled in his hands and was reduced to nothing. He remarked it to himself with a start, or, at any rate, he did at least remark, for to shudder at it was foreign to his ears. It seemed to him that from the beginning of time he had been lying and looking thus. One day, some 10 or 12 had passed since Hans Castorp retired to bed. There was a knock on his door at about this hour, before Joachim had returned from dinner and the social half-hour. Upon Hans Castorp's inquiring, "Come in," it opened, and Ludovico Settembrini appeared, and lo, on the instant the room was flooded with light. For the visitor's first motion, while still on the threshold, had been to turn on the electric light, which filled the room in a trice with vibrating brilliance and reverberated from the gleaming white ceiling and furniture. The Italian had been the only one of the guests after whom Hans Castorp had expressly asked in these days. Joachim, indeed, when he stood or sat by his cousin for 10 or 15 minutes, and that happened 10 times in the course of the day, would relate whatever there was of interest or variation in the daily life of the community, and Hans Castorp's questions, whenever he put any, had been of a general nature. The exile wished to know whether there were new guests, or if any of the familiar faces were absent. It seemed to gratify him that only the former was the case. There was one newcomer, a hollow-cheeked, green-complexioned young man, who had been given a place at the next table on the right with Frau Iltis and the ivory-skinned Levi. Hans Castorp might look forward to the pleasure of seeing him. So no one had left? Joachim answered in a curt negative, his eyes on the ground. But he had to reply to this question every day or so, until at last he became restive and sought to answer once for all by saying that, so far as he knew, no one was purposing to leave. Nobody did leave very much. Up here, as a matter of fact. But Hans Castorp had asked after Settembrini by name, and desired to hear what he had said to it. To what? Why, that I am in bed, and supposed to be ill. Settembrini, it seemed, had expressed himself on the subject, though briefly. On the very day of Hans Castorp's disappearance, he had come to find out his whereabouts of Joachim, obviously prepared to hear that the guest had departed, and on learning the explanation had responded only in Italian. First, ecco, and then poveretto. As much as to say, there you are, poor chap. It needed no more Italian than the cousins could boast to understand the sense in which he uttered the words. Why poveretto? Hans Castorp inquired. He sits up here with his literature made of politics and humanism, and he is very little good for the ordinary interests of life. He needn't look down his nose and pity me like that. I shall get down to the flatland before he does. And now Settembrini stood here in the suddenly illuminated room. Hans Castorp, who had raised himself on his elbow and turned blinking toward the door, recognized him and flushed. Settembrini wore, as usual, his thick coat with the wide lapels, a frayed turnover collar, and the check trousers. As he came from supper, he was armed with the usual wooden toothpick. The corner of his mouth, beneath the beautiful curve of his mustache, displayed the familiar fine, dry, critical smile. "Good evening, engineer. May I be permitted to look in on you? If so, I need light. You will pardon my taking it upon myself." And he waved his small hand toward the lamp in the ceiling. "You are absorbed in contemplation. I should not wish to disturb you. A tendency to meditate is surely natural under the circumstances, and if you want to talk, you have your cousin. You see, I am well aware that I am superfluous. But even so, we live here close together. A sympathy springs up between man and man, intellectual and emotional sympathy. It has been a full week that we have not seen you. I began to think you had left, as I saw your place empty down in the refectory. The lieutenant told me better, or should we say worse, if that would not sound impolite? Well, and how are you? How do you feel? Not too much cast down, I hope." "Ah, that is you, Herr Settembrini. How friendly of you. Refectory. Oh, I say, that is good. Always at your jokes, but do sit down. You are not disturbing me in the least. I was lying there musing. No, musing is too much to say. I was simply too lazy to turn on the light. Thanks very much. I am subjectively as good as normal, and my cold is much better from lying in bed. But it was a secondary phenomenon, so everybody tells me. My temperature is still not what it should be. I have 99.5 degrees to 99.7 degrees, all the time." "You take your temperature regularly?" "Yes, 6 times a day like the rest of you." "Pardon me, I am still laughing at your calling our dining hall a refectory. That is what they are called in a cloister, isn't it? After all, there is some resemblance. Not that I have been in a cloister, but I imagine there's something like this. And I have the rule at my fingers' ends and observe it faithfully, as a pious brother should. One might say that your novitiate is at an end, and you have made your profession. My formal congratulations. You even say our dining hall. But, without meaning to affront your manly dignity, you remind me more of a young nun than a monk, a regular new-shorn, innocent bride of Christ, with great martyr-like eyes. I have seen such lambs, here and there about the world, never without a certain access of sensibility. Yes, your cousin has told me about it. So you had yourself examined after all, at the 11th hour. Since I was febrile, of course, Herr Settembrini. What do you want? If I had been at home, I should have consulted a physician. And here, at the source and fount, so to speak, with 2 specialists in the house, it would have been very strange. Of course. And you took your temperature, too, before they told you to. But they did recommend it, from the beginning. And the Mylendonk slipped you the thermometer? Slipped me? Since the occasion arose, I bought one from her. I understand. An irreproachable transaction. And how many months did the chief knock you down for? Good heavens, I have asked you that before. Do you remember? You had just come. You answered with such assurance. Of course I remember. I have had many new experiences since that time, but that I remember as though it were yesterday. You were so amusing, and spoke of barons as the judge of the lower regions. Radames, was it? No, wait, that is something else. Rhadamanthus? Yes, I may have called him that. I am afraid I do not remember every phrase that happens to well up to my lips. Rhadamanthus, of course. Minos and Rhadamanthus. And you spoke to us of Carducci at the same time. Pardon me, my dear young friend, we will, if you please, leave him out. The name, at this moment, sounds too strange upon your tongue. That's good too, laughed Hans Castorp. But I have learned a good deal about him through. Yes, at that time I had not the faintest suspicion. I answered you that I was here for 3 weeks. I did not know any different. The Kleefeld girl had just been whistling at me with her pneumothorax. I hardly knew where I was. But I was feeling febrile even then, for the air up here is not only good against the illness, it is also good for it. It sometimes brings it to the surface, which is of course a necessary step in the cure. An alluring hypothesis. And has Hofrat Behrens also told you about the German-Russian woman we had here last year? No, year before last, for 5 months? He did not? He should have. A charming woman, of Russo-German origin, married, a young mother. She came from the Baltic provinces somewhere, lymphatic, anemic, but probably some more serious trouble as well. She spent a month here and complained that she felt ill all the time. They told her to be patient. Another month passes. She continues to assert that she is actually worse instead of better. They point out to her that only the physician can judge how she is. She herself only knows how she feels, which does not signify. They're satisfied with the condition of her lung.
Good.
She says no more. She goes on with the cure and loses weight by the week. The 4th month she faints during the examination. That is nothing, says Behrens. Her lung is perfectly satisfactory. But by the 5th month she cannot get about. She goes to bed and writes to her husband, out in the Baltic provinces. Behrens gets a letter from him marked personal and urgent in a very firm hand. I saw it myself. Yes, says Behrens and shrugs his shoulders. It seems to be indicated that she certainly cannot stand the climate up here. The woman was beside herself. He ought to have said that before. She had felt it from the beginning. She declared. They had killed her among them. Let us hope she recovered her strength when she went back to her husband. Oh, that's good. That's very good. You do tell stories capitally, Herr Settembrini. Every word is so plastic. And that story about the girl that went bathing in the lake, the one they gave the silent sister to take her temperature with, I have often laughed at it, all by myself. Yes, what strange things do happen. One lives and learns. But my own case is still quite uncertain. The Hofrat is supposed to have discovered a trifling weakness, places where I was infected long ago. I heard them myself when he tapped me, and some fresh places he can hear now. What a funny word fresh is to use in such a connection. But so far there are only the acoustic indications. Real diagnostic certainty we shall only arrive at when I am about again, and the X-ray and photography have taken place. Then we shall have positive knowledge. You think so? You know that the photographic plate often shows spots that are taken for cavities when there are none there? And that sometimes it shows no spots, although there is something there? Madonna, the photographic plate. There was a young numismatician up here, with fever, and since he had fever, there were cavities plain to be seen on the plate. They could even hear them. They treated him for phthisis, and he died. The post-mortem showed his lung to be sound. The cause of his death was some coccus or other. Oh, come, Herr Settembrini. Talking about post-mortems already. I haven't got that far yet, I assure you. Engineer, you are a wag. And you are an out-and-out critic and skeptic, I must say. You do not even believe in science. Can you see spots on your plate, Herr Settembrini? Yes, it shows some spots. And you really are ill too? Yes, I am unfortunately rather ill, replied Settembrini, and his head drooped. There was a pause, in which he gave a little cough. Hans Castorp, from his bed, regarded his guest, whom he had reduced to silence. It seemed to him that with his 2 simple inquiries he had refuted Settembrini's whole position, even the Republic and the Bellow style. And he did nothing on his side to resume the conversation. After a while Herr Settembrini straightened himself, with a smile. Tell me, engineer, he said, how have your family taken the news? What news do you mean? Of my delayed return? Oh, my family, consists of 3 uncles, a great-uncle, and his 2 sons, who are more like my cousins. Other family I have none. I was doubly orphaned when I was very small. As to how they took it, they know as much and as little as I myself. At first, when I had to go to bed, I wrote that I had a severe cold and could not travel. Yesterday, as it seemed rather long after all, I wrote again, saying that my catarrh had drawn Hofrat Behrens' attention to the condition of my chest, and that he insisted I should remain until he is clear what the condition is. You may be perfectly sure they took it calmly. It didn't upset them. And your position? You spoke of a sphere of practical activity, where you were intending to enter shortly on certain duties. Yes, as volunteer apprentice. I have asked them to excuse me for the present. You must not imagine they are in despair over my defection. They can carry on indefinitely without an assistant.
Good.
Everything is in order, then, in that direction. Perfect equanimity all along the line. It is a phlegmatic race of people in your part of the country, is it not? But energetic, certainly? Oh, yes, very energetic, said Hans Castorp. He mentally essayed the temper of his native city and found that his interlocutor had characterized it justly. Phlegmatic and energetic, yes, I should say they are. I assume, continued Settembrini, in case your stay is prolonged, we shall make the acquaintance of your uncle, I mean your great-uncle, shall we not? He will undoubtedly come up to ascertain your condition. Out of the question, cried Hans Castorp. Under no conceivable circumstances. Wild horses could not drag him up here. My uncle is apoplectic, you understand, he has almost no neck at all. No, he has to have a reasonable atmospheric pressure. It would be worse for him up here than it was for your lady from the Baltic provinces. He would be in a dreadful way. I am disappointed. And apoplectic? Energy and phlegm are not much use under those circumstances. Your uncle is rich, I suppose? You are all rich down your way. Hans Castorp smiled at her Settembrini's literary generalizations. And again, from his distant couch, he cast a metaphorical eye upon the sphere from which he had been snatched. He called up memories. He made an effort to judge objectively, and found that distance enabled him to do so. He answered, one is rich, or else one isn't. And if not, so much the worse. I myself am no millionaire, but what I have is secured to me. I have enough to live on and be independent. But personalities aside. Well, if you had said one must be rich, I should have agreed with you. If you aren't rich, or if you leave off being, then woe be unto you. Oh, they will say about this or that person. He hasn't any money, has he? Literally that, and making just such a face. I have often heard them, and I see now it made an impression on me, which it would not have done, of course, unless it had struck me as strange. Or, don't you think that follows? No, I don't think you, for instance, as Homo humanus, would feel very comfortable down there. It often struck me that it was pretty strong, as I can see now, though I am a native of the place, and for myself have never had to suffer from it. If a man does not serve the best and dearest wines at his dinners, people don't go, and his daughters are left on his hands. That is what they are like. Lying here, and looking at it from this distance, I find it pretty gross. What were the words you used? Phlegmatic and energetic. That's very good. But what does it mean? It means hard, cold. And what do hard and cold mean? They mean cruel. It is a cruel atmosphere down there, cruel and ruthless. When you lie here and look at it, from a distance, it makes you shudder. Settembrini listened, and nodded after Hans Castorp had come to an end, for the present, of his pronouncement and fallen silent. Then he took a breath and said, I will not seek to extenuate the specific forms which life's normal cruelty assumes in your native sphere. It is all one, for the reproach of cruelty rests upon somewhat sentimental grounds. You would scarcely even have leveled it, while you were in that atmosphere, for fear of being ridiculous in your own eyes. You left it to the drones to make, and rightly. That you make it now bears witness to a certain estrangement, which I should be sorry to see increase, since he who falls in the habit of making it is in danger of being lost to life, to the manner of life to which he was born. Do you know, engineer, what I mean by being lost to life? I know it, I see it here, every day. 6 months at most after they get here, these young people, and they are mostly young who come, have lost every idea they had, except flirtation and temperature. And if they remain a year, they will have lost the power of grasping any other. They will find any other cruel, or, more precisely, ignorant and inadequate. You are fond of anecdote. I could serve your turn. I could tell you of a young man I know, a husband and son, who was up here for 11 months. He was a little older than you, yes, rather older. They let him go home, provisionally, as much improved. He returned to the bosom of his family, not uncles, you understand, but his wife and his mother. The whole day he lay with a thermometer in his mouth. He took no interest in anything else. You don't understand, he said. No one understands who has not lived up there. Down here, the fundamental conception is lacking. In the end, it was the mother who settled it.
Go back, she said.
There is nothing to be done with you anymore. He went back home. You know, don't you, that they call this home when they have once lived here? He was entirely estranged from his young wife. She lacked the fundamental conception, and she gave up trying to get it. It was borne in upon her that he would find a mate up here who had it, and that he would stop with her. Hans Castorp seemed to be only half listening. He went on staring into the incandescent brilliance of his white room, as into far space. He laughed belatedly and said, "He called it home? That is sentimental, as you say. You know no end of stories." I was still thinking of what we said about hardness and cruelty. The same idea has gone through my head a number of times in these days. You see, a person has to have a rather thick skin to find it natural, the way they have of thinking and talking down there, the "has he got any money?" and the face they make when they say it. It never came quite natural to me, though I am no homo humanus. I can see, now I look back, that I was always struck by it. Perhaps that had to do with my tendency to illness, though I did not know about it at the time, those old places which I heard myself the other day. And now Barron's has found a fresh place. That, I must say, was a surprise to me, and yet, in a way, I don't know that it was, after all. I never have felt myself as firm as a rock, and my parents, both of them, dying so young, for I have been doubly orphaned from youth up, you know. Her Settembrini described a single gesture, with head, hand, and shoulders. Pleasantly, courteously, it put the question, "Well, and what of it?" "You are an author," Hans Castorp said. "A literary man. It must be easy for you to understand a thing like that. You can feel how under those circumstances a man might not be of tough enough fiber to find that sort of cruelty quite natural, the cruelty of ordinary people who go about joking and making money and filling their bellies. I don't know if I am expressing myself." Settembrini bowed. "You mean," he interrupted, "that the early and repeated contact with death developed in you a tendency which made you sensitive to the harshness and crudity, let us say the cynicism, of our everyday, worldly existence." "Precisely," cried Hans Castorp, in honest enthusiasm. "You have expressed it to A.T., her Settembrini.
Contact with death."
"I was sure that you, as a literary man—" Settembrini put out his hand, laid his head on one side, and closed his eyes. It was a mild and beautiful gesture, a plea for silence and further hearing. He held it some seconds, even after Hans Castorp had ceased to speak, and was waiting in suspense for what was to come. But at length he opened his black eyes, organ-grinder eyes, and spoke. Permit me, engineer, to say to you, and to bring it home to you, that the only sane, noble, and I will expressly add, the only religious way to think of death is as part and parcel of life, to regard it, with the understanding and with the emotions, as the inviolable condition of life. It is the very opposite of sane, noble, reasonable, or religious to divorce it in any way from life, or to play it off against it. The ancients adorned their sarcophagi with the emblems of life and procreation, and even with obscene symbols. In the religions of antiquity, the sacred and the obscene often lay very close together. These men knew how to pay homage to death. For death is worthy of homage, as the cradle of life, as the womb of palingenesis. Severed from life, it becomes a specter, a distortion, and worse. For death, as an independent power, is a lustful power whose vicious attraction is strong indeed. To feel drawn to it, to feel sympathy with it, is without any doubt at all the most ghastly aberration to which the spirit of man is prone. Her Settembrini left off speaking. He finished with this generalization, and made it the definite period of his discourse. He had spoken in a very serious vein and by no means with conversational intent. He even refrained from giving Hans Castorp the opportunity for a rejoinder, but simply dropped his voice at this point and concluded his remarks. He sat now with his lips closed, his hands folded in his lap, one leg in its check trouser flung over the other, slightly swinging the foot, which he regarded with an austere expression. Hans Castorp, too, preserved silence. He leaned back in his plumeau, turned his head to the wall, and drummed with his finger ends on the coverlet. He felt set to rights, chidden, corrected. In his silence there was no little childish obstinacy. The pause lasted some time. At length Herr Settembrini lifted his head and said with a smile, "You very likely recall, engineer, that we have had a similar discussion once before. One might say the same discussion. We were talking about disease and dullness. I think we were taking a walk, and you found the combination a paradox, on the ground of your reverence for ill health. I called that reverence a dismal fancy, which dishonored human thought, and I was gratified to find you not disinclined to entertain my plea. We spoke of the neutrality and the intellectual indecision of youth, of its liberty of choice, of its inclination to play with all possible points of view, and that one should not, or need not, regard these experimentations as final and definite elections. Will you permit me?" Herr Settembrini smiled and bent forward as he sat, his feet close together on the floor, his hands between his knees, his head stretched out and a little on one side. "Will you permit me?" And his voice had the faintest tremor in it, "to be beside you in your essays and experiments, and to exercise a corrective influence when there appears to be danger of your taking up a destructive position." "Why, certainly, Herr Settembrini." Hans Castorp hastened to abandon his forced and even peevish attitude, stopped drumming on the bedcover, and turned to his guest with friendliness, even with contrition. "It is uncommonly kind of you. I must ask myself if I really, that is, if there is anything—" "Signed pecunia, of course," quoted Herr Settembrini, as he rose. "I can't let myself be outdone." They both laughed. The outer door opened, next moment the inner one as well. It was Joachim, returned from society. When he saw the Italian he flushed, as Hans Castorp had done. The deep bronze of his face deepened by another shade. "Oh, you have company," he said. "How nice for you. I was detained. They made me make one of a table of bridge." "They call it bridge," he said, shaking his head, "as they do outside, but it was really something else entirely. I won 5 marks. "Only so it doesn't become a vice with you." Hans Castorp laughed. "Ahem. Herr Settembrini has beguiled the time for me. No, that is not the proper expression, though it may be all right for your mock bridge. Herr Settembrini has filled the time for me, and given it content, whereas when mock bridge breaks out in our midst, a respectable man feels he has to fight his way through. And yet to have the privilege of listening to Herr Settembrini, to get the benefit of his good counsel, I could almost wish to keep my fever and stop up here with you indefinitely. They would have to give me a silent sister to measure with." "I repeat, engineer, you are a wag," said the Italian. He took leave gracefully and went. Alone with his cousin, Hans Castorp heaved a sigh. "Oh, what a schoolmaster," he said. "A humanistic one, of course. He never leaves off setting you right, first by means of anecdote, then by abstractions. And the things one gets to talk about with him, things you would never have thought you could talk about or even understand. And if I had met him down below," he added, "I never should have understood." At this hour Joachim would remain with him for a while, sacrificing a half or 3/4 of an hour of the evening cure. Sometimes they played chess on Hans Castorp's magic table. Joachim had brought a set of chessmen from below. Then he would take his wrappings and go into the balcony, thermometer in mouth, and Hans Castorp too took his temperature for the last time, while soft music, near or far, stole up from the dark valley. The cure ended at 10. He heard Joachim, he heard the pair from the bad Russian table. He turned on his side and invited slumber. The night was the harder half of the day, for Hans Castorp woke often and lay not seldom hours awake, either because his slightly abnormal temperature kept him stimulated, or because his horizontal manner of life detracted from the power, or the desire, to sleep. To make up for their briefness, his hours of slumber were animated by extremely lively and varied dreams, which he could ponder on awaking. And if the hours of the day were shortened by their frequent division into small sections, it was the blurred monotony of the marching hours of the night which operated with the like effect. Then, as dawn came on, he found it diverting to watch the gradual gray, the slow emergence of the room and the objects in it, as though by the drawing of veils, to see day kindling outside, with smoldering or with lively glow, and it was always a surprise when the moment came round again, and the thump of the bathing master on his door announced to Hans Castorp that the daily program was again in force. He had brought no calendar with him on his holiday and did not always find himself sure of the date. Now and then he asked his cousin, who, in turn, was not always quite sure either. True, the Sundays, particularly the fortnightly one with the concert, it was the second Hans Castorp had spent in this situation, gave him a fixed point. So much was certain that by little and little they had now got well on in September, close on to the middle. Since he went to bed, the cold and cloudy weather had given place to a succession of wonderful midsummer days. Every morning Joachim appeared arrayed in white flannel trousers to greet his cousin, and Hans Castorp felt a pang of regret, in which both heart and youthful muscles joined, at the loss of all this splendid weather. He murmured that it was a shame, but added to console himself that even if he were up and about he would hardly know how to take advantage of it, since it seemed it did not answer for him to exert himself much. And the wide-open balcony door did afford him some share of the warm shimmer outside. But toward the end of his prescribed term of lying, the weather veered again. It grew misty and cold overnight. The valley was hid by gusts of wet snow, and the dry heat of the radiator filled the room. Such was the day on which Hans Castorp reminded the doctor, on his morning round, that the 3 weeks were out, and asked leave to get up. "What the deuce? You don't say," said Behrens. "Time's up, is it? Let's see. Yes, you're right. Good Lord, how fast we grow old. Things haven't changed much with you in the meantime. Normal yesterday?" "Yes, up to 6 o'clock in the afternoon." "Well, Castorp, I won't grudge you human society any longer. Up with you, man, and get on with your walks, within the prescribed limits, of course. We'll take a picture of the inside of you, make a note of it," he said as he went out, jerking his great thumb over his shoulder at Hans Castorp and looking at the pallid assistant with his bloodshot, watery blue eyes. Hans Castorp left the caboose. In galoshes, with his collar turned up, he accompanied his cousin once more to the bench by the watercourse and back. On the way he raised the question of how long the Hofrat might have let him lie had he not been reminded, and Joachim, looking worried, opened his mouth to emit a single pessimistic syllable, spread out his hands in an expressive gesture, and gave it up. Sudden enlightenment. A week passed before Hans Castorp received, through the directress von Meilendonck, the summons to present himself in the X-ray laboratory. He had not liked to press matters. The Berghof was a busy place. Doctors and assistants had their hands full. New guests had recently come in, 2 Russian students with shocks of hair and black blouses closed to the throat, showing not a vestige of linen, a Dutch married couple, who were given places at Settembrini's table, and a hunchbacked Mexican, who frightened his table by fearful attacks of asthma when he would clutch his neighbor, whether man or woman, in an iron grip like a vice and draw him, as it were, struggling and crying for help, into the circle of his own extremity. The dining room was nearly full, though the winter season did not actually begin until October. And Hans Castorp's case was scarcely of such severity as to give him any special claim to attention. Frau Storr, for all her stupidity and ill-breeding, was unquestionably worse off than he, not to mention Dr. Blumenkohl. One must have lacked all discrimination not to have behaved retiringly in Hans Castorp's place, particularly since discrimination was in the atmosphere of the house. The mild cases were of no great account, that he had often heard. They were slightingly spoken of, looked at askance, not only by the more serious and the very serious cases, but even by each other. Logically, of course, each mild case was thus driven to think slightingly of itself, yet preserved its individual self-respect by merging it with the general, as was natural and human. "Oh," they would say, of this or that patient, "there's not much amiss with him. He hardly even ought to be up here. He has no cavities at all." Such was the spirit. It was aristocratic in its own special sense, and Hans Castorp deferred to it, out of an inborn respect for law and order of every sort. It was natural to him to conform to the proverb which bids us, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. And indeed travelers show small breeding when they jeer at the customs and standards of their hosts, for of characteristics that do honor to their possessors there are all sorts and kinds. Even toward Joachim, Hans Castorp felt a certain deference, not so much because he was the older inhabitant, his guide and cicerone in these new surroundings, as because he was unquestionably the more serious case of the two. Such being the attitude, it was easy to understand that each patient inclined to make the most he could of his individual case, even exaggerating its seriousness, so as to belong to the aristocracy, or come as close to it as possible. So Hans Castorp, when asked at table, might add a couple of tenths to his temperature, and could never help feeling flattered when they shook their fingers at him and called him an artful dodger. But even when he laid it on a little, he still remained a member of the lower orders, in whom an attitude of unassuming diffidence was only right and proper. He took up the life of his first 3 weeks, that familiar, regular, well-regulated life with Joachim, and it went as pat as though he had never left it off. The interruption, indeed, had been insignificant, as he saw when he resumed his seat at table. Joachim, who laid deliberate stress on such occasions, had decorated his place with a few flowers, but there was no great ceremony about the greetings of the other guests. These were almost what they would have been after a separation of 3 hours instead of 3 weeks. This was not due to indifference toward his simple and sympathetic personality, nor to preoccupation with their own absorbing physical state, but merely because they had actually not been conscious of the interval. And Hans Castorp could readily follow them in this, since sitting there in his place at the end of the table, between the schoolmistress and Miss Robinson, it was as though he had sat here no longer ago than yesterday at the furthest. If, even at his own table, the end of his retirement caused no stir, how should it have been remarked in the rest of the dining-room? And literally no soul had taken notice of it save Settembrini, who strolled over at the end of the meal to exchange a lively greeting. Hans Castorp, indeed, would have made a mental reservation, in which he may or may not have been justified. He told himself that Claudia Chowchat had noticed his return, that she had no sooner made her tardy entrance and let the glass door slam behind her than she rested her narrow gaze upon him, which he had met with his own, and that even after she sat down, she had turned and looked toward him, smiling over her shoulder, as she had 3 weeks before, on the day of his examination. The movement had been so open, so regardless of both himself and the other guests, that he did not know whether to be in ecstasies over it or to take it as a mark of contempt and feel angry. At all events, his heart had contracted beneath this glance, which so markedly and intoxicatingly gave the lie to the lack of social relations subsisting between him and the fair patient. It had contracted almost painfully at the moment when the glass door slammed, for to that moment he had looked forward with his breath coming thick and fast. It must be said that Hans Castorp's sentiments toward the patient of the good Russian table had made distinct progress during his retirement. The sympathy he entertained in his mind and his simple heart for this medium-sized person with the gliding gait and the Kirghiz eyes, as good as amounted to being in love. We shall let the word stand, although in strictness it is a conception of down below, a word of the plains, capable of giving rise to a misconception, namely, that the tender ditty beginning, "One word from thy sweet lips," was to some extent applicable to his state. Her picture had hovered before him in those early hours when he had lain awake and watched the dawn unveil his chamber, or at evening when the twilight thickened. It had been vividly present the night Settembrini had suddenly entered his room and turned on the light, was the reason why he had colored under the humanistic eye. In each hour of his diminished day he had thought of her, her mouth, her cheekbones, her eyes, whose color, shape, and position bit into his very soul, her drooping back, the posture of her head, her cervical vertebra above the rounding of her blouse, her arms enhanced by their thin gauze covering. Possessed of these thoughts, his hours had sped on soundless feet. If we have concealed the fact, we did so out of sympathy for the turmoil of his conscience, which mingled with the terrifying joy his visions imparted. Yes, he felt both terror and dread. He felt a vague and boundless, utterly mad and extravagant anticipation, a nameless anguish of joy which at times so oppressed the young man's heart, his actual and corporeal heart, that he would lay one hand in the neighborhood of that organ, while he carried the other to his brow and held it like a shield before his eyes, whispering, "Oh, my God!" For behind that brow were thoughts, or half-thoughts, which imparted to the visions their perilous sweetness. Thoughts that had to do with Madame Cha-Cha's recklessness and abandon, her ailing state, the heightening and accentuation of her physical parts by disease, the corporealization, so to speak, of all her being as an effect of disease, an effect in which he, Hans Castorp, by the physician's verdict, was now to share. He comprehended the grounds of her audacity, her total disregard and smile and glance of the fact that no social relation existed between them, that they did not even know each other. It was as though they belonged to no social system, as though it were not even necessary that they should speak to each other. Precisely this it was that frightened Hans Castorp, for frightened he was, in the same sense as when, in the consulting room, he had looked from Joachim's nude body with panic-stricken searching up to his eyes, only that then the grounds of his fear had been pity and concern, whereas here something quite different was in play. But now the Berghof life, that wonderfully favored and well-regulated existence, was once more in full swing on its narrow stage. Hans Castorp, whilst awaiting his X-ray examination, continued to enjoy its measured course, together with good cousin Joachim, and to do, hour for hour, precisely as he did. No question but his cousin's society was beneficial to our young man. For though Joachim's were but a companionship in suffering, yet he suffered, as it were, conformably with military etiquette, even, though unconsciously, to the point of finding satisfaction in the service of the cure, of substituting it for the service down below, and making of it an interim profession. Hans Castorp was not so dull as not to perceive all this, yet at the same time he was aware of its corrective and restraining influence upon his more civilian temper. It may have been this companionship, its example and the control it exercised, which held him back from overt steps and rash undertakings. For he saw all that Joachim had to endure from the daily assaults of an orange-scented atmosphere, commingled of such elements as round brown eyes, a little ruby, a great deal of unwarranted laughter, and a bosom fair to outward eyes. The honor and good sense which made Joachim flee these enticements gripped Hans Castorp, kept him under control, and prevented him from borrowing a lead pencil, so to speak, from the narrow-eyed one, a thing which he otherwise, from what we know of him, might well have been ready to do. Joachim never spoke of the laughter-loving Marussia, and thus Hans Castorp could not mention Claudia Chauchat. He made up for this by his stolen commerce with the schoolmistress at table, when he would sit supporting his chin after the manner of old Hans Lorenz, and tax the spinster with her weakness for the charming invalid, until her face positively flamed. He pressed her to find out new and interesting facts about Madame Cha-Chat's personal affairs, her origin, her husband, her age, the particulars of her illness. He wanted to know if she had children. Oh, no, she had none. What should a woman like her do with children? Probably she was strictly forbidden to have any, and if she did, what kind of children would they be? Hans Castorp was forced to acquiesce. And now it was probably late in the day, he threw out, with prodigious objectivity. Madame Cha-Chat's profile, at times, seemed to him already a little sharp. She must be over 30. Fräulein Engelhardt rejected the idea with scorn. 30? At worst, not more than 28. She forbade her neighbor to use such words about Claudia's profile. It was the softest, sweetest, most youthful profile in the world, and at the same time interesting. Of course it was not the profile of any ordinary healthy bread-and-butter miss. To punish him, she went on to say that she knew Frau Chauchat entertained a male visitor, a certain fellow countryman who lived down in the Platz. She received him afternoons in her chamber. It was a good shot. Hans Castorp's face changed in spite of himself. He tried to react, saying, well, you don't say so, but the words sounded strained. He was incapable of treating lightly the existence of this fellow countryman of Frau Chauchat, much as he wished to appear to do so, and came back to it again and again, his lips twitching. A young man? Young and good-looking, according to all accounts, the schoolmistress answered. She could not say from her own observation. Was he ill? Only a light case at most. Let us hope, Hans Castorp remarked with scorn, that he displays more linen than the other two at the bad Russian table. Fräulein Engelhardt, on punishment intent, said she could vouch for that. He gave in and admitted that it was a matter for concern. He earnestly charged her to find out all she could about this young man who came and went between the Platz and Frau Chauchat's room. A few days later she brought him, not information about the young Russian, but a fresh and startling piece of news. She knew that Claudia Chauchat was having her portrait painted and asked Hans Castorp if he knew it too. If not, he might be assured she had it on the best authority. She had been sitting for some time to a person here in the house, and the person was the Hofrat. Yes, her Hofrat Barons, no less, and he received her for the purpose almost daily in his private dwelling. This intelligence affected Hans Castorp even more than the other. He made several forced jokes about it. Why, certainly, the Hofrat was known to occupy himself with oil painting. Why not? It wasn't a crime. Anybody was free to paint. And the sittings took place in the widower's own house. He hoped, at least, that Fräulein von Meilendonck was present. The schoolmistress objected that the directress was probably too busy. No busier than the doctor ought to be, Hans Castorp severely rejoined. The remark sounded final, but he was far from letting the subject drop. He exhausted himself in questions about the picture, what size it was, and whether it was a head or a knee-length, about the hours of a sitting, but Fräulein Engelhardt could not gratify him with these particulars, and had to put him off until she could make further inquiry. Hans Castorp measured 99.7 degrees as a result of this communication. The visits Frau Chauchat received upset him far less than these she made. Her personal and private life, quite aside from what went on in it, had begun to be a source of anguish and unrest. How much keener, then, were his feelings when he heard such questionable things about the way she spent her time. Speaking generally, it was altogether possible that her relations with the Russian visitor had a disinterested and harmless character. But Hans Castorp had been for some time now inclined to reject harmless and disinterested explanations as being in the nature of twaddle, nor could he regard in any other light this oil painting, considered as a bond of interest between a widower with a robust vocabulary and a narrow-eyed, soft-stepping young female. The taste displayed by the Hofrat in his choice of a model was too like Hans Castorp's own for him to put great faith in the disinterested character of the affair, and the thought of the Hofrat's purple cheeks and bloodshot, goggling eyes only strengthened his skepticism. An observation which he made in these days, of his own accord and quite by chance, had a different effect upon him, though here again what he saw confirmed his own taste. There sat, at the same table with Frau Salomon and the greedy schoolboy with the glasses, at the cousin's left, near the side door, a patient who was, so Hans Castorp had heard, a native of Mannheim. He was some 30 years old, his hair was thin, his teeth poor, and he had a self-depreciating manner of speech. He it was who played the piano evenings, usually the wedding march from Midsummer Night's Dream. He was said to be very religious, as those up here naturally often were. Every Sunday, he went to service down in the Platz, and in the rest cure he read devotional books with a chalice or palm branch on the front cover. This man's eyes, so Hans Castorp one day observed, traveled the same road as his own. They hung upon Madame Chauchat's lissom person with timid, dog-like devotion. Once Hans Castorp had remarked this, he could not forbear corroborating it again and again. He saw him stand, of an evening, in the card-room, among the other guests, quite lost in gazing at the lovely, contaminate creature on the sofa in the small salon, in talk with the whimsical, fuzzy-haired Tamara, Dr. Blumenkohl, and the hollow-chested, stooping young men who were her table-mates. He saw him turn away, then twist his head, with a piteous expression of the upper lip, and roll his eyes back over his shoulder in her direction. He saw him color and not look up, but then gaze avidly as with a crash the glass door fell to, and Frau Chauchat slipped to her place. And more than once he saw how the poor soul would place himself, after the meal, between the good Russian table and the exit, in order that she might pass close by him. She gave him neither glance nor thought, while he devoured her at close range with eyes full of sadness to their very depths. This discovery of his affected young Hans Castorp no little, though the plaintive, devouring gaze of the Mannheimer did not trouble his rest like the thought of Claudia Chauchat's private relations with Hofrat Barons, a man so much his superior in age, person, and position. Claudia took no interest in the Mannheimer. Had she done so, it would not have escaped Hans Castorp's perception. In this case, it was not the dart of jealousy he felt pierce his soul. But he did have all the sensations which the drunkenness of passion knows, when it sees its own case duplicated in the outer world, and which form a most fantastic mixture of disgust and fellow-feeling. To explore and lay open all the windings of his emotions would keep us far too long. Suffice it to say that his observation of the Mannheimer gave our poor young friend enough to think on and to suffer. In this wise passed the week before his X-ray examination. He had not known it was so long. But one morning at early breakfast, he received the order through the directress. She had a fresh sty, so this harmless though disfiguring ailment was clearly constitutional, to present himself in the laboratory that afternoon. And behold, when he came to think of it, a week had passed. He and his cousin were to go together a half-hour before tea. The occasion would serve for Joachim to have another X-ray taken, as the old one was by now out of date. They shortened the main rest period by 30 minutes and, promptly as the clock struck 3:30, descended the stairs to the so-called basement and sat down in the small antechamber between the consulting room and the laboratory. Joachim was quite cool, this being for him no new experience. Hans Castorp rather feverishly expectant, as no one, up to the present, had ever had a view into his organic interior. They were not alone. Several other patients were already sitting when they entered, with tattered illustrated magazines on their laps, and they all waited together. A young Swede, of heroic proportions, who sat at Settembrini's table, of whom one heard that, when he entered, the previous April, he had been so ill they had almost refused to take him, but he had put on nearly 6 stone, and was about to be discharged cured. There was also a mother from the bad Russian table, herself a lamentable case, with her long-nosed, ugly boy, named Sasha, whose case was more lamentable still. These 3 had been waiting longer than the cousins, and would therefore go in before them. Evidently, there had been some sort of hitch in the laboratory, and a cold tea was on the cards. They were busy in there. The voice of the Hofrat could be heard, giving directions. It was somewhat past the half-hour when the door was opened by the technical assistant to admit the Swedish giant and Fortune's minion. His predecessor had evidently gone out by another door. But now matters moved more rapidly.